I found my son sitting on a park bench, while the Chicago winter wind cut through the bare trees like a knife. Snow had just started to fall, dusting the shoulders of his expensive Italian coat. Beside him sat my grandson, Leo, shivering against a pile of Louis Vuitton suitcases that looked ridiculous sitting in the mud. I pulled my rusted 2005 Ford F-150 up to the curb and let the engine idle. The vibration of the truck was the only thing keeping me calm. I rolled down the window. Kendrick looked up at me. His eyes were red, not from the cold, but from the shame of a man who has lost his ability to protect his family. I asked him why he was not at work. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He looked at his wife, Victoria, who was weeping silently into a silk handkerchief, and then back at me. He said that Richard Sterling had fired him. He said his father-in-law had kicked them out of the penthouse. Then he told me the reason. He said Richard told him that our bloodline was not worthy of walking on his carpets. He said we were dirt that had temporarily been allowed to sit on velvet. I did not yell. I did not honk the horn. I simply unlocked the passenger doors. "Get in the car," I said. My voice was low and steady. It was time Richard Sterling learned that some dirt contains iron, and iron is what destroys velvet every single time. Before I tell you how I brought a manufacturing empire to its knees, using nothing but a flip phone and patience, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone who the real boss is. The heater in my truck rattled as we drove away from the upscale district, leaving the skyline of privilege in our rearview mirror. The silence in the cab was suffocating. Leo was 5 years old and confused, clutching a toy robot as if it were a lifeline. I looked at Kendrick in the passenger seat. He was 32 years old, a brilliant systems engineer, a man who had graduated with honors, yet he was curled in on himself like a beaten child. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said. I needed the details. I needed the fuel for what I was about to do. Kendrick took a deep breath. He told me they had been eating breakfast when Richard walked in with 2 security guards. There was no warning. There was no discussion. Richard simply pointed at the door. When Kendrick asked why, Richard laughed. He told the guards to remove the trash. Kendrick said the guards grabbed them while they were still in their house slippers. They were not allowed to pack. The luggage on the curb was what the maids had thrown out after them, mostly clothes that Richard deemed too ugly to stay in his house. The detail that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel was about the shoes. Kendrick said he tried to put sneakers on Leo because it was freezing outside. Richard stopped him. Richard told him to get out immediately, and that if he scratched the imported oak floors with his frantic movements, he would sue Kendrick for property damage. My grandson was forced out into the snow in his socks because a man was worried about his floorboards. I looked in the rearview mirror at Leo's feet. They were wrapped in Victoria's scarf. "That is not just an eviction," I said quietly. "That is a declaration of war." Victoria sobbed harder in the back seat. She apologized. She said she should have known her father would do this eventually. She said she was sorry for dragging us into this mess. I did not answer her. Apologies do not keep children warm. Action does. We crossed the invisible border that separates the haves from the have-nots. The smooth pavement turned into cracked asphalt. The glass skyscrapers were replaced by brick row houses that had seen better days. This was the South Side. This was my kingdom, though to them, it looked like a ruins. I pulled into the driveway of the small brick bungalow I had lived in for 40 years. It was a sturdy house, built with honest labor and paid for with cash. It did not have oak floors, but it had heat. I parked the truck and told them to go inside. The front door creaked as I opened it. The smell of old pine, machine oil, and sage greeted us. It was the smell of my life. To me, it smelled like freedom. To Victoria, it clearly smelled like failure. I watched her as she stepped into the living room. The furniture was old. The sofa was a plaid pattern from the 90s, worn soft by decades of use. The carpet was clean, but threadbare in spots. Victoria stood in the middle of the room, clutching her coat tight around her body, as if she were afraid of catching a disease from the air. She looked at the wooden dining chair. I saw her hesitate. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a tissue, and quickly wiped the seat before sitting down. She thought I did not see it. I saw everything. I saw the way her nose wrinkled at the dust motes dancing in the light. I saw the way she pulled Leo onto her lap to keep him from touching the floor. It would have been easy to be offended. I could have told her that this house was paid for, that I owned the land it sat on, and that I had zero debt, while her father was leveraged to his eyeballs. But I said nothing. A general does not reveal his artillery during a skirmish. I went to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. Kendrick came in and sat at the table. He put his head in his hands. He looked around the kitchen where he had grown up. He saw the faded wallpaper and the old refrigerator that hummed too loudly. I could see the guilt eating him alive. He felt he had failed his wife by bringing her here. He felt he had failed his son. "I am sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I did not want you to see us like this. We will find a hotel tomorrow. I just need to access our savings." I poured 3 mugs of hot cocoa. I placed one in front of him, one in front of Victoria, and a smaller plastic cup for Leo. "Drink," I said. "You are not going to a hotel. You are staying here. This is your home." Victoria took the mug but did not drink. She looked at Kendrick with pleading eyes. I knew what that look meant. She wanted to leave. She wanted to go back to a world where chairs did not need to be wiped, and where the heating vents did not rattle. Kendrick pulled out his phone. He said he was going to order some pizza because there was no food in the fridge. I watched him open the delivery app. He selected 2 large pizzas and a bottle of milk for Leo. He tapped to pay. A second later, a sharp beep echoed in the quiet kitchen. Kendrick frowned. He tapped the screen again. Another beep. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. Kendrick stared at the screen. He turned the phone so I could see it. A red notification box flashed across the display. "Transition declined. Account frozen. Please contact your bank." He quickly opened his banking app. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely type his passcode. When the account balance loaded, he gasped. It showed 0. Not just 0, but a negative balance due to pending fees. "It says the account is locked," Kendrick said, panic rising in his throat. "It says there is a fraud investigation initiated by the primary guarantor." "Richard," Victoria whispered. Her face went pale. "Since he helped us set up the account for the mortgage, his name is technically on the paperwork as a guarantor." "He froze it," Kendrick said, slamming the phone onto the table. The screen cracked. "He froze everything. We have no money. We have no credit cards. We cannot even buy milk for Leo." Leo looked up at the mention of his name. He rubbed his stomach and said he was hungry. The sound of my grandson saying he was hungry in my own kitchen, while a billionaire played games with numbers on a computer screen, triggered something deep inside my chest. It was not a hot anger. It was a cold, metallic resolve. It felt like a gear clicking into place. Kendrick stood up and kicked the leg of the table. He screamed in frustration. He paced the small kitchen, running his hands through his hair. He looked trapped. He looked like a man who had been stripped of his weapons and thrown into a pit. "He wants us to crawl back," Kendrick spat out. "He knows we have nothing. He wants me to beg him." Victoria looked down at her cocoa. I saw a tear fall into the dark liquid. She did not say anything, but I knew she was considering it. Begging was better than starving. Begging was better than living in a house that smelled like old oil. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, a reminder of my 70 years on this earth. I walked over to the counter where I kept an old cookie jar shaped like a bear. It was chipped on the ear. Victoria watched me with confusion. She probably thought I was going to offer them a stale cookie. I lifted the heavy ceramic lid. I reached inside, past the empty space where cookies should be, and pulled out the false bottom. I withdrew a thick envelope wrapped in rubber bands. I walked back to the table and tossed it in front of Kendrick. It landed with a heavy thud that made the spoons rattle. "There's $3,000 in there," I said. "Cash. Go buy my grandson some pizza, and get him some new shoes." Kendrick stared at the money. He looked at me, stunned. He knew I lived on a pension. He knew I drove a 20-year-old truck. He could not understand where I got this kind of cash. "Dad," he stammered, "I can't take this. This is your life savings." "It is not my savings," I lied. "It is my war chest, and the war has just started." I looked at Victoria. She was staring at the money as if it were a miracle. But I was not looking at the cash. I was looking at the phone with the cracked screen. Richard Sterling had not just evicted them. He had tried to starve a 5-year-old boy to prove a point about genetic superiority. He thought he had cut off their supply line. He thought he was the only source of power in this city. I turned away from them and walked to the window, looking out at the falling snow. The streetlights flickered on, illuminating the cracked sidewalk. Richard Sterling thought he was a giant because he stood on a pile of money. He did not know that he was standing on ground that I owned. He did not know that the logistics company that delivered the raw materials to his factory was a subsidiary of a holding company that I founded 30 years ago under a different name. He saw a retired mechanic in a flannel shirt. He did not see the architect of his destruction. "Go get the food," I said, without turning around. "Tonight we eat. Tomorrow we hunt." The pizza boxes were empty, but the relief was short-lived. It started with a sound that every parent knows and dreads. It was a high-pitched whistle, a wheeze that came from my grandson's chest. Leo was clutching his throat, his small eyes widening in panic. Victoria frantically dumped the contents of her purse onto the kitchen table. Lipstick, a compact mirror, and a wallet tumbled out. But the blue inhaler was missing. She looked up at Kendrick, terror draining the color from her face. "We left it," she whispered. "It is on the nightstand in the guest room." Kendrick did not hesitate. He grabbed his coat. I grabbed my keys. We did not speak. We simply moved with the urgency of men who knew the stakes. The drive back to the north side felt different this time. The first trip had been a retreat. This trip was a rescue mission. My truck roared down the highway, its engine complaining as I pushed it past the speed limit. Beside me, Kendrick was on the phone with the pharmacy. But it was Sunday night, and they needed a new prescription authorization. We did not have time for bureaucracy. We had to go back to the source. When we pulled up to the limestone walls of the Sterling estate, the world seemed to have frozen over. The snow was falling harder now, covering the manicured hedges in a pristine white blanket that looked too perfect to be real. I stopped the truck at the main gate. The iron bars were 12 feet high, topped with gold spikes that looked like spears. Kendrick rolled down the window and pressed the intercom button. "It is me," Kendrick said, his voice tight. "Leo is having an asthma attack. We need his medicine. It is in the guest room." There was a pause. Static crackled on the line. Then a voice I recognized came through. It was the night security guard, a man Kendrick had tipped generously every Christmas for 5 years. "I am sorry, Mr. Hayes," the guard said. "I have strict orders. No entry." Kendrick slammed his hand against the door of the truck. "Open the gate, Mike," he shouted. "This is not about the house. My son cannot breathe." The guard's voice was apologetic, but firm. "If I open this gate, I lose my job." Mr. Sterling was very clear. He said any breach of the perimeter would be treated as trespassing. I looked at the security camera mounted on the stone pillar. The red light blinked slowly, like an unblinking eye. I knew Richard was watching. He was inside that warm, well-lit fortress, sitting by a fire, watching us freeze on a monitor. This was not about security. This was about power. He wanted to see how far he could push us before we broke. I put the truck in park. I told Kendrick to stay inside. I opened my door and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind whipped my flannel shirt, but I did not button my jacket. I walked up to the camera. I did not shout. I stared directly into the lens. I knew he was there. "Richard," I said, my voice low and even, "I know you can hear me. You can keep the clothes. You can keep the furniture. But if you do not bring that medicine out here in 2 minutes, I will take this truck and I will drive it through your front gate. And I promise you the repair bill will be the least of your problems." I stood there, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. I turned back to the truck and put my hand on the door handle. I was not bluffing. The bumper on my Ford was solid steel. I calculated the angle of impact. Suddenly, the floodlights on the main house turned on, blinding us with white light. The front door opened. A figure emerged, wrapped in a cashmere robe, holding a glass of scotch in one hand. It was Richard Sterling. He walked down the long, heated driveway with a leisurely pace, flanked by 2 guards. He stopped 5 feet from the gate. He took a sip of his drink, savoring the warmth while we stood in the snow. In his other hand, he held the small blue plastic inhaler. Kendrick jumped out of the truck. He ran to the gate, gripping the cold iron bars. "Just give it to me, Richard," he pleaded. "Please, he is just a child." Richard looked at Kendrick with a mixture of amusement and disgust. He looked at the inhaler, then back at my son. "You should have thought about his health before you failed to provide a stable home for him," Richard said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and absolutely venomous. He tossed the inhaler. He did not hand it to Kendrick. He did not pass it through the bars. He threw it high over the gate. The plastic canister spun in the air, catching the light, before landing hard on the asphalt driveway. It skittered across the ice and came to rest near my muddy boots. "Fetch," Richard said. Kendrick froze. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the bars. I saw the rage building in his shoulders. He wanted to rip the gate off its hinges. He wanted to kill. Richard laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Look at you," he sneered. "You look like a stray dog begging for scraps." He turned his gaze to me. "And you, Solomon, I see where he gets it from. You should teach your dog not to bark at his betters. It is embarrassing." I bent down slowly. My joints ached, but I kept my movement fluid. I picked up the inhaler. I wiped the road salt and dirt from the mouthpiece with my thumb. I checked to make sure it was not cracked. It was intact. That was all that mattered. I walked up to the gate. I stood inches from Richard, separated only by the black iron. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. I could see the broken veins in his nose. "You mistake silence for weakness, Richard," I said. My voice was soft, barely a whisper over the wind. "You think because I do not shout, I do not bite." Richard smirked. "Is that a threat, mechanic? Get off my property before I call the police." I shook my head. "It is not a threat. It is a forecast. Enjoy your scotch. Enjoy your heated driveway. Because winter is coming for you, Richard, and you have no idea how cold it is going to get." I turned my back on him. It was the ultimate insult to a man like Richard. I denied him the satisfaction of a reaction. I walked back to the truck, handed the inhaler to Kendrick, and put the car in gear. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Richard was still standing there, holding his glass, looking smaller and smaller as the distance grew. He thought he had won a skirmish. He did not realize he had just mobilized an army. The drive back to the south side was silent. Kendrick administered the medicine to Leo as soon as we walked in the door. The sound of the wheezing stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, easy breathing of a sleeping child. Victoria slumped in a chair, exhausted. The crisis had passed, but the air in the house was heavy. Kendrick walked to the window and looked out at the street. He looked defeated. "That man is a monster," he whispered. I never knew he could be that cruel." "He is not a monster," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. "Monsters are myths. He is just a man. A frightened, small man who uses money as a shield. And shields can be broken." I heard a car door slam outside, then footsteps on the walkway. It was late, past midnight. No one visited at this hour unless it was bad news. I went to the front door. I turned on the porch light. A man in a cheap raincoat was standing there. He held a clipboard. "Solomon Hayes?" he asked. "That is me." He peeled a document off the clipboard and taped it to my front door. He did not hand it to me. He treated the door like a barrier he did not want to cross. "You have been served," he mumbled, and hurried back to his car. I opened the door and ripped the paper down. Kendrick and Victoria came up behind me. I walked into the light of the kitchen to read it. It was a court summons, an emergency motion for temporary custody. I read the words aloud, my voice flat. "Richard Sterling is petitioning the family court for immediate custody of Leo Hayes. The petition cites that the current guardians, Kendrick and Victoria Hayes, are homeless, unemployed, and unable to provide the basic necessities of life, including medical care." Victoria gasped and covered her mouth. "He can't do that," she cried. "He kicked us out. He made us homeless." "That is his strategy," I said, tossing the paper onto the table next to the pizza crusts. "He creates the problem. Then he uses the problem to prove you are unfit. He wants to break you. He wants you to run back to him, begging for forgiveness, willing to give up your husband just to keep your son." Kendrick looked at the paper, then at me. His eyes were wild. "Dad, we have to hire a lawyer. We need the best, but we have no money. You saw the accounts. They are frozen." I looked at the bold letters at the top of the summons. The hearing was set for 48 hours from now. Richard moved fast. He had judges in his pocket and lawyers on retainer. He thought he was playing chess against opponents who did not even know the rules. I walked over to the phone on the wall. It was an old landline, beige and clunky. I lifted the receiver and dialed a number I had not called in 10 years. It rang once, twice. A voice answered on the third ring. It was gravelly, tired, but alert. Reynolds. "Hello, Arthur," I said. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, the sound of a chair scraping against a floor, as if the man had stood up in shock. "Solomon? Is that you? I thought you retired. I thought you were done with the game." "I was," I said, looking at my son and my grandson sleeping on the couch. "But the game decided to come to my doorstep. I need you to dust off the files." "Which files?" Reynolds asked. "All of them," I said. "We are activating the dormant accounts." "And Arthur?" "Yes, Solomon. I want you to look into the debt structure of Sterling Manufacturing. I want to know who owns his loans. I want to know who insures his inventory. I want to know everything." I hung up the phone. Kendrick was watching me. He looked confused, like he was seeing a stranger wearing his father's face. "Who was that?" Kendrick asked. "That was the cavalry," I said. "Go to sleep, son. You are going to need your strength. Richard wants a war over custody? Fine. We will not just fight for custody. We are going to fight for his kingdom." I turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness. But I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the snow fall on the south side streets. My hands were steady. My heart was slow. Richard Sterling had thrown a plastic inhaler at my feet like I was a dog. He had forgotten one thing about dogs. If you corner them, and if you threaten their pack, they do not just bark. They rip your throat out. And I had very sharp teeth that I had not used in a long, long time. The next morning, the sun rose over the south side, casting long gray shadows through the barred windows of my home. The light did not bring warmth. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Kendrick was already up. I found him in the small bathroom, trying to steam the wrinkles out of his only suit by hanging it next to the shower. The suit was navy blue, tailored for a man who used to sit in boardrooms, but now it looked tired, just like him. He was shaving with a disposable razor I had bought at the corner store. I watched him cut himself, a small bloom of red appearing on his chin. He dabbed it with a piece of toilet paper, his hand trembling slightly. He was terrified, but he was also determined. He told me he had 5 interviews lined up. He had spent the entire night on his phone, using the neighbor's spotty Wi-Fi to send out resumes. His credentials were impeccable. Master's degree in systems engineering, 5 years of experience managing complex logistics for Sterling Manufacturing. On paper, he was a catch. In reality, he was a walking target. I handed him the keys to my truck. I told him the starter was tricky and he had to pump the gas twice before turning the key. He looked at the rusted Ford F-150, then at his Italian leather shoes. He swallowed his pride, took the keys, and nodded. "Good luck," I said. He did not smile. He just walked out into the snow, a soldier marching into a battle he did not know was rigged. I spent the day waiting. I did not sit by the phone. I occupied myself in the place where I did my best thinking, the garage. It was a detached structure behind the house, drafty and smelling of grease and old metal. To the neighborhood, it was just a place where old Solomon tinkered with junk. To me, it was a sanctuary. I walked past the workbench covered in tools and pulled a tarp off a stack of framed documents leaning against the wall. I picked up a rag and began to wipe away the layers of grime. The glass gleamed, revealing the intricate diagrams underneath. United States Patent Number 4,500,892. Advanced Hydraulic Load Distribution System. Inventor, Solomon Hayes. I picked up another one. Automated Supply Chain Algorithm. Inventor, Solomon Hayes. There were 12 of them. 12 patents that form the backbone of modern industrial shipping. The very systems that Richard Sterling's factory used to move his products were based on designs I had drawn at this very workbench 30 years ago. I was not just a mechanic. I was the ghost in the machine. I had sold the usage rights to a holding company, but kept the ownership. The royalties went into trust funds and investments that compounded quietly while I lived a simple life. I did not need mansions. I needed to know that my mind had changed the world. I looked at the patents, and then I looked at the empty space where my truck usually sat. I knew I could make one phone call. I could call the CEO of any logistics firm in the state and demand they hire my son. I could write a check that would buy Richard Sterling's entire neighborhood. But I kept my phone in my pocket. A father does not help his son by fighting his battles for him. A father helps his son by letting him feel the weight of the sword. Kendrick had lived a soft life. He had been sheltered by scholarships I secretly funded, and then by the luxury of the Sterling family. He needed to know what it felt like to be rejected. He needed to know that the world does not care about your degree if it thinks you are broken. He needed to build the armor that only scar tissue can provide. So I wiped the dust off my legacy, and I waited for him to come home bleeding. When the truck pulled into the driveway that evening, the engine sounded like it was crying. Kendrick walked into the kitchen and collapsed onto a chair. Victoria was there instantly, her eyes wide with hope. She asked him how it went. She asked if they offered a signing bonus. She asked if we could move out tomorrow. Kendrick did not look at her. He looked at his hands. He said the first interview went perfectly. The hiring manager was impressed. He shook Kendrick's hand and practically offered him the job on the spot. Then, the manager said he just needed to make a quick call to verify his last employment at Sterling Manufacturing. Kendrick said he waited in the lobby for 20 minutes. When the manager came back, the warmth was gone. The smile was replaced by a look of cold suspicion. He told Kendrick that the position had just been filled internally. He asked Kendrick to leave the building immediately. It happened 5 times. 5 different companies. 5 different managers who looked at him like he was a criminal. At the last interview, an old friend from college was honest enough to tell him the truth. He told Kendrick that his file in the state industry database had been flagged. It had a red tag that said, "Security risk, intellectual property theft." Richard Sterling had not just fired him, he had blacklisted him. He had painted a scarlet letter on my son's resume that no amount of explaining could wash away. Victoria burst into tears. She screamed that her father was evil. She screamed that it was unfair. Kendrick just sat there, the light gone from his eyes. He whispered that he was sorry. He said he was worthless. I stood in the doorway, wiping grease from my hands. I wanted to hold him. I wanted to tell him that I could fix it. But I stayed silent. The iron was in the fire. It was getting hot. If I pulled it out now, it would be brittle. I had to let him burn a little longer so he could become steel. But the universe has a way of testing you when you are already down. That night, the temperature in Chicago dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The wind howled against the brick walls of my bungalow. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that made my blood freeze. It was silence. The rhythmic clanking of the old furnace in the basement had stopped. I threw off my quilt and rushed to the basement. I could see my breath in the air. I banged on the side of the boiler, hoping to jar it back to life, but it was dead. The pilot light was out and the pump had seized. The cold was already seeping through the floorboards, an invisible enemy invading our last refuge. I ran upstairs. I heard Victoria screaming my name. I burst into the guest room. She was holding Leo in her arms. My grandson was shaking violently, his teeth chattering, but his skin was burning hot. His face was flushed, a deep, unnatural red. "He is burning up," Victoria sobbed. "He is so hot, but he says he is freezing." I touched Leo's forehead. It was like touching a stove. He was delirious, mumbling about his toy robot. I grabbed the thermometer from the nightstand. I jammed it into his ear. The beep sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. 104 degrees. "We have to go," I shouted. "Wrap him in everything you have." Kendrick was already moving, grabbing blankets, his exhaustion forgotten in the face of adrenaline. We ran out to the truck. The seats were like blocks of ice. I prayed to every ancestor I knew as I turned the key. The engine coughed. It sputtered. "Please," I whispered, "do not fail me now." The engine roared to life. We drove through the deserted streets, running red lights, sliding around corners on the black ice. Leo was whimpering in the back seat, a high, thin sound that tore at my heart. Victoria was praying the Hail Mary over and over again, her voice cracking on every line. We pulled up to the emergency room entrance of Mercy Hospital. I carried Leo in my arms. He felt so light, too light, like a bird with broken wings. We burst through the automatic doors. The fluorescent lights were blinding. The smell of antiseptic and misery hit us. We ran to the reception desk. A woman behind safety glass looked up from her computer. She did not look at the dying child in my arms. She looked at our clothes. She saw Kendrick's wrinkled suit. She saw my grease-stained flannel. She saw Victoria's tear-streaked face. "Name and insurance card," she said, her voice flat. Kendrick slapped his hands on the counter. "We do not have the card," he panted. "Our insurance was canceled yesterday. Please, my son has a fever of 104. He needs a doctor now." The woman stopped typing. She looked at us over the rim of her glasses. She did not blink. If you do not have insurance, hospital policy requires an upfront payment for emergency admission for non-trauma cases. How much? Kendrick asked, reaching for his empty wallet out of habit. $5,000, she said. Cash or credit card? The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. $5,000. To Richard Sterling, that was a bottle of wine. To Kendrick, in that moment, it was an impossible sum. It was the price of his son's life, and he did not have it. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic so raw it was hard to look at. He knew I had given him the cash from the cookie jar, but that was gone, spent on food, diapers, and the inhaler. We had maybe $50 left in our pockets. I do not have it, Kendrick whispered, his voice breaking. Please, he is just a boy. Bill me later. I will sign anything. The woman shook her head. I cannot override the system, sir. No payment, no admission. There is a free clinic 3 miles down the road. They open at 8 in the morning. It was 3 in the morning. Leo let out a soft moan and went limp in my arms. His eyes rolled back in his head. He was having a febrile seizure. Victoria screamed. It was a primal sound, the sound of a mother watching her cub die. Kendrick grabbed the receptionist's glass partition and shook it. "Help him!" he roared. I looked at my grandson. I looked at the receptionist who was reaching for the security button, and then I looked at the exit door. I felt the weight of the credit card in my hidden inner pocket, the black card that belonged to the Solomon Hayes Trust, the card I had sworn never to use because it would alert the financial world that I was active again. It would leave a digital trail that Richard Sterling could eventually find. But looking at Leo's convulsing body, the patents in the garage did not matter. The lesson about toughness did not matter. The war with Richard did not matter. I handed Leo to Kendrick. "Hold him," I said. I stepped up to the glass. I did not yell. I reached into the lining of my coat. I ripped the seam with my thumb and pulled out a thin black card made of titanium. I slammed it onto the counter. The sound rang out like a hammer striking an anvil. "Run it," I commanded. "And get a doctor. Now." The receptionist looked at the card. Her eyes widened. She looked at the name embossed in silver. She looked at me, the old man in the flannel shirt. Her hand trembled as she reached for the card terminal. She swiped it. Approved. The screen flashed green. Doors buzzed open. Nurses came running. As they took Leo from Kendrick's arms and rushed him onto a gurney, I saw Kendrick looking at me. He was looking at the black card in my hand. He was looking at me with confusion, and for the first time, suspicion. He realized then that his father was not just a retired mechanic who got lucky with a cookie jar. He realized there were depths to me that he had never seen, and as the doctors surrounded his son, I knew the secret was beginning to crack. But I did not care. My grandson was going to live, and Richard Sterling was going to pay for every single degree of that fever. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room hummed with a sound that drilled directly into my skull. It was a sterile, white noise that did nothing to drown out the sounds of my family falling apart. We had been sitting there for an hour since the doctors took Leo behind the double doors. The initial relief of his admission had evaporated, replaced by a new, suffocating terror. A nurse had come out 10 minutes ago with a clipboard and a grim expression. She told us that while Leo was stable, the seizure had been caused by a severe underlying infection aggravated by the cold. He needed a specialized antibiotic treatment and potentially a few days in the pediatric ICU. Then she dropped the hammer. She told us that the credit card I had used, the titanium black card that had bought us entry, had been flagged by the issuer as potential theft. The transaction had been reversed. The hospital administration, wary of a family that looked like us, ragged and desperate, was demanding a $5,000 cash deposit immediately to continue the treatment. If we could not pay, they would stabilize him and transfer him to the county charity ward, a place where patients waited in hallways for days. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg sitting next to me. Victoria finally snapped. She stood up, her face streaked with mascara and tears, and her hands shook as she dug into her coat pocket for her phone. She looked at Kendrick with eyes that were no longer full of love. They were full of accusation. "I am calling him," she screamed. Her voice echoed off the linoleum floors, turning the heads of sleepy patients in the corner. "I do not care what you say, Kendrick. I am calling my father. He can wire the money in 5 seconds. Kendrick jumped up as if he had been slapped. He grabbed her wrist. He did not hurt her, but his grip was iron. "You will not call him," he said, his voice a low growl. "Victoria, think. If you call him, he wins. He will pay the bill, yes, and then he will show the receipt to the judge tomorrow. He will prove that we cannot provide for our son. He will take Leo away from us forever." Victoria tried to wrench her arm free. "I do not care about the judge," she shrieked. "I care about my son breathing. You are letting your ego kill him. You and your father and your stupid pride. We are living in a house with no heat. We have no food. And now you want to gamble with Leo's life because you hate my father?" She was hysterical. The panic had stripped away her logic. She saw a lifeline in Richard Sterling. She did not see the noose attached to the end of it. Kendrick looked at me, pleading for help, but he held his ground. "Victoria, listen to me. Richard caused this. He locked the accounts. He threw the inhaler in the snow. He wants us to fail. If we take his money now, we are selling Leo to him. Do you understand? We are selling our son." Victoria stopped struggling. She looked at Kendrick, and for the first time, I saw hate in her eyes. It was the hate of a mother who feels trapped. "Then give me the money," she hissed. "Give me the $5,000, Kendrick. Right now." "Oh wait, you can't. Because you are worthless." The word hung in the air like smoke. Kendrick recoiled. He let go of her arm and stepped back, his shoulders slumping. He looked destroyed. He had done everything right. He had gone to school. He had worked hard. He had been a good father. And now, the woman he loved was looking at him like he was garbage because a billionaire had decided to ruin his life. I sat there, watching them. My heart broke for my son, but my mind remained cold. This was the fracture. This was the crack in the foundation that Richard had engineered. He knew he didn't have to destroy us personally. He just had to apply enough pressure until we destroyed each other. I stood up. The joints in my knees popped, a sound like dry wood snapping. I walked over to them. I did not raise my voice. I did not lecture. "Sit down," I said to Victoria. She looked at me, ready to scream again, but something in my eyes stopped her. It was not the look of a kindly grandfather. It was the look of a man who had stared down union riots and corporate takeovers in the 70s. "Sit down," I repeated. She sank onto the hard plastic chair, sobbing into her hands. Kendrick stood there, looking at his shoes, shame radiating off him in waves. "Wait here," I told them. "Do not move. Do not call anyone." I turned and walked out of the sliding glass doors into the brutal Chicago night. The cold hit me like a physical blow, freezing the sweat on my neck. I walked to my truck, the old Ford F-150 sitting under the yellow glare of the street lamp. It looked like a piece of junk. Rust ate at the wheel wells. The bumper was dented. To the world, it was the vehicle of a man who had failed. I unlocked the door and climbed inside. I did not start the engine. Instead, I reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a rusty box cutter that I used for stripping wire. I turned on the overhead dome light. I looked at the passenger seat. The upholstery was gray fabric, stained with coffee and grease from years of use. I took the blade and jammed it into the backrest of the seat. I sliced downward. The fabric tore with a satisfying ripping sound. Yellow foam spilled out. I reached deep into the tear, past the springs, past the foam, until my fingers brushed against plastic. I pulled out a vacuum-sealed bag. It was heavy. I sat there for a moment, holding the bag in my calloused hands. This was not drug money. This was not stolen money. 20 years ago, when I stepped down from the daily operations of my logistics empire, I had taken the final dividend payout in cash. I had wrapped it, sealed it, and buried it in the one place I knew no one would ever look, in the seat of a truck that wasn't worth $500. It was my emergency fund, my nuclear option. I had saved it for a day when the banks failed or the grid went down. I had never intended to use it, but looking at the hospital entrance, thinking about my grandson hooked up to machines, and my son being humiliated by his wife, I knew the emergency was here. I sliced the bag open. The smell of old money filled the cab. It was a musty, sharp scent of ink and paper that had been sleeping for 2 decades. I pulled out a stack of $100 bills. They were the old-style notes, the ones with the smaller portraits of Franklin. I counted out $5,000. Then I counted another $5,000 just in case. I shoved the bundle into my jacket pocket and taped the seat cushion back together with duct tape from the glove box. I walked back into the hospital. I marched straight to the billing counter. The same administrator was there, typing on her computer, looking bored. She didn't look up when I approached. "Name?" she asked, without enthusiasm. "Solomon Hayes," I said. She sighed. "Sir, like I told you, unless you have the payment." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brick of cash. I slammed it onto the counter. The sound was loud, heavy, and undeniable. It sounded like a judge's gavel. $5,000, I said. Cash. The woman jumped. She stared at the money. She stared at the old, worn-out bills. She looked at me, then back at the money. She picked up a bill and held it to the light, checking the watermark, probably assuming it was counterfeit because a black man in a flannel shirt couldn't possibly have legitimate cash. "It is real," I said, my voice cutting through her suspicion. "It is older than you are. Now, admit my grandson into the ICU and get him the best specialist you have on staff. If I find out you gave him generic aspirin because you thought we were poor, I will buy this hospital and fire you." She swallowed hard. She quickly typed something into her computer, the printer word. She handed me a receipt, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. We will transfer him immediately." I turned around. Kendrick and Victoria were watching me from the chairs. Kendrick's mouth was slightly open. Victoria looked stunned. They had no idea where the money came from. To them, I was a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat. But I wasn't a magician. I was a man who prepared for winter while everyone else was enjoying the summer. I walked over to them. I handed the receipt to Kendrick. "He is safe," I said. Kendrick took the paper. He looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. "Dad, how? Where did you—" "It does not matter," I said, sitting down heavily. "He is safe." Victoria looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and shame. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, but she never got the chance. The automatic doors at the entrance slid open with a whoosh. A gust of cold wind blew into the waiting room, followed by 4 police officers. They were not walking casually. They were moving with purpose. Their hands were resting on their holsters. Behind them, looking smug and concerned, was a man in a beige trench coat. I recognized him immediately. It was the private investigator Richard Sterling had hired, the one who had been parked outside my house. The lead officer scanned the room. He spotted us. He spotted the flannel shirt. He spotted the black man sitting next to a terrified young couple. He pointed a finger at me. "That is him," the officer said. "Solomon Hayes." They surrounded us in seconds. The hospital waiting room went silent. People stared. The stigma was immediate. Black family, police, cash. Everyone assumed the worst. "Mr. Hayes," the officer said, stepping into my personal space. "We received a tip from a concerned citizen regarding suspicious financial activity and potential narcotics trafficking." Kendrick stood up, placing himself between me and the officer. "What? That is insane. My father is a retired mechanic." The officer ignored him. He looked at the bulge in my jacket pocket where the rest of the cash was. He looked at the receipt in Kendrick's hand. "We have a report that you just made a large cash payment with old bills, typical of money laundering operations," the officer said. "And we have information that you are in possession of a significant amount of undeclared currency." I looked past the officer, straight at the private investigator standing by the door. He was typing on his phone, reporting to his master. Richard had not just blocked the credit card. He had set a trap. He knew that if he squeezed us hard enough, we would have to produce money from somewhere. And when we did, he would be ready to label it illegal. "Sir, stand up and place your hands behind your back," the officer commanded. "We need to bring you in for questioning regarding the source of these funds." Victoria gasped. Kendrick shouted, "No! You can't do this! He is saving my son's life!" I stood up slowly. I felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around my wrists. It was a familiar feeling, one I hadn't felt since the civil rights protests of my youth. But this was different. This wasn't about civil rights. This was about a father destroying a grandfather to own a child. I looked at Kendrick. "Do not fight them," I said calmly. "Stay with Leo." "Dad, this is Richard," Kendrick yelled, tears streaming down his face as the officers pushed me forward. "He is doing this." "I know," I said. As they marched me out of the hospital, past the staring eyes of the nurses and patients, I did not hang my head. I walked with my chin up. Richard Sterling thought he had checkmated me. He thought that by arresting me, he would leave Kendrick helpless and force Victoria to return home. He was wrong. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. By bringing the police into this, By creating an official record, he had just given me the venue I needed to expose him. He wanted a legal battle? He was going to get one. I sat in the back of the squad car, the hard plastic seat digging into my back. I watched the hospital disappear in the distance. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said from the front seat. I smiled in the darkness. Oh, I would remain silent. For now. But when I finally spoke, the whole world was going to hear it. And Richard Sterling was going to wish he had never learned my name. The metal table in the interrogation room was cold enough to numb my elbows through the fabric of my flannel shirt. The room smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the sour sweat of every man who had sat in this chair before me. Across from me sat Detective Miller. He was a young man with ambition written all over his face. He looked at me like I was a trophy buck he had just taken down. To him, I was not a grandfather who had just saved a child. I was a statistic. I was a suspect. I was a problem to be solved and filed away. Miller slammed a file onto the table. The sound echoed off the cinder block walls. He leaned in close, invading my personal space. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted to see the old black man from the South Side flinch. I did not flinch. I watched him with the patience of a man who has stared down union strikes and hostile boardrooms. I counted the beats of his heart in the vein of his neck. He was nervous. He was bluffing. "Where did the money come from, Solomon?" Miller asked. His voice was loud, theatrical. "We ran a background check. You are a retired mechanic. You live on a pension of $1,200 a month. And yet, you walk into a hospital and drop $5,000 in cash like it is pocket change. That kind of money does not come from fixing radiators. That kind of money comes from selling drugs." I sat back in the metal chair. The handcuffs bit into my wrists, but I focused on the pain. It kept me sharp. I looked Miller in the eye. "It is my savings," I said calmly. "I worked for 40 years. I saved every penny." Miller laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't lie to me. We know about the accounts. We know about the suspicious activity. Richard Sterling told us everything. He told us you have been acting erratic. He told us you have been desperate." "Richard Sterling is a liar," I said, "and you were doing his dirty work." Miller's face turned red. He was about to grab my collar when the heavy steel door of the interrogation room swung open. The air in the room changed instantly. A man walked in. He was older, with silver hair and a uniform that commanded respect. It was Chief Henderson. I had not seen him in 10 years, not since I anonymously donated the funds to build the new police gymnasium. He did not know my face, but he knew the name. He knew the file that had just been flagged in the system. Miller stood up straight. "Chief, I have him on the ropes. He is about to crack." Henderson did not look at Miller. He looked at me. He looked at the handcuffs. His face went pale. He walked over to the table and picked up the file Miller had thrown down. He opened it and looked at the financial report that had come back from the federal database. It did not show a mechanic's pension. It showed the assets of the Hayes Trust, a blind trust with security clearance level 4. Henderson closed the file. His hands were shaking slightly. He turned to Miller. "Unlock him," Henderson said. His voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of an absolute order. Miller blinked. "What?" "Chief, this guy is a—" "I said unlock him," Henderson snapped. "Now, and delete the arrest record. This man was brought in for questioning as a witness. He is not a suspect. He never was." Miller looked confused, but he knew better than to argue. He fumbled for his keys. He unlocked the cuffs. I rubbed my wrists. I stood up. I looked at Henderson. Our eyes met. He gave me a slight nod. It was a nod of apology. It was a nod of fear. He knew that if I wanted to, I could bury this entire precinct in lawsuits by morning. "Thank you, Chief," I said. "I assume I am free to go." Henderson opened the door for me. "You are free to go, Mr. Hayes. We apologize for the inconvenience." I walked out of the interrogation room. I walked through the bullpen where officers were typing reports and drinking bad coffee. I walked out the front doors of the precinct into the pre-dawn light. The city was quiet. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in a sheet of white. And there he was. Richard Sterling was leaning against the hood of his silver Mercedes, parked across the street. He was wearing a camel hair coat and smoking a cigar. He looked like the king of the world. He saw me walk out. He did not look surprised that I was released. He probably assumed I had made bail. He took a long drag of his cigar and blew the smoke into the cold air. He smiled. It was a smile of pure malice. He pointed a finger at me, then made a slashing motion across his throat. He thinks he won, I thought. He thinks he humiliated me. He thinks he showed my son that I am powerless. I did not walk toward him. I did not shout. I turned left and walked down the block. I walked until I found what I was looking for, a payphone. It stood on the corner, battered and covered in graffiti, a relic of a bygone era, just like me. I picked up the receiver. It was cold against my ear. I dropped a quarter into the slot. The dial tone hummed. I dialed a number I had memorized 30 years ago. It rang 3 times. A voice answered. It was Reynolds. He sounded awake. He was always awake. "Yes," Reynolds said. "It is time," I said into the mouthpiece. My breath fogged in the air. "Solomon?" Reynolds asked. "Are you sure? Once we start this, there is no going back." I looked down the street at the silver Mercedes. Richard was getting into his car, laughing on his cell phone. "I am sure," I said. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Target Sterling Manufacturing. Cut the steel." There was a pause on the line. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. Reynolds was already working. "Understood," Reynolds said. "The supply chain is severed, effective immediately." I hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment, listening to the city wake up. Protocol Omega was not just a cancellation of orders. It was a nuclear option built into the contracts of my holding company. It allowed the supplier to halt all shipments immediately if the buyer's credit rating dropped below a certain threshold. And thanks to my earlier call to the bank, Richard's credit was currently under review. The steel that Sterling Manufacturing needed to build their high-end components was specialized. It came from one foundry, my foundry, and without it, his factory was just a building full of expensive paperweights. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and began the long walk back to the hospital. I had a grandson to visit, and Richard Sterling had a very bad day ahead of him. The sun rose over the industrial district of Chicago. At the Sterling Manufacturing plant, the morning shift whistle blew at 7 o'clock sharp. Hundreds of workers streamed through the gates, clocking in, ready to start the assembly lines. The factory floor was a cathedral of noise and motion. Conveyor belts hummed. Robotic arms waited to weld. Sparks usually flew within minutes, but today there were no sparks. The foreman, a burly man named Jack, walked over to the loading dock. The bay doors were open. The morning delivery trucks should have been there. They were always there. 5 trucks, loaded with high-grade steel coils, arriving precisely at 7:15. This was the just-in-time delivery system that Richard bragged about to his shareholders. It saved money on storage, it was efficient, but it had a weakness. If the trucks did not come, the line stopped. Jack looked at his watch, 7:20. No trucks. He walked to the dispatcher's office. He called the transport company. The phone rang and rang. Finally, a recording played. "Due to a flag on your account, all deliveries have been suspended. Please contact our legal department." Jack turned pale. He ran out onto the factory floor. The machines were running dry. The reserves were empty. "Shut it down!" Jack screamed over the noise. "Shut it down before we burn the motors!" One by one, the great machines ground to a halt. The conveyor belts stopped. The robotic arms froze in midair. The hum of the factory died, replaced by a terrifying silence. The workers looked around, confused. They pulled off their safety goggles. They whispered. In his office on the top floor, Richard Sterling was pouring his first cup of coffee. He was humming a tune. He felt good. He had crushed his son-in-law. He had jailed his enemy. He was in control. Then, the floor beneath his feet stopped vibrating. Richard frowned. He put down his cup. He walked to the window that overlooked the factory floor. He looked down. Nothing was moving. 500 workers were standing still, looking up at his office window. The phone on his desk rang. It was a jarring, violent sound in the silence. Richard picked it up. "Mr. Sterling," the foreman shouted, panic in his voice. "The steel! It is not here! The trucks never came! The line is dead!" Richard dropped the phone. He looked at the silent factory. He looked at the empire he thought he owned. And for the first time in his life, he felt the cold grip of fear around his heart. He did not know it yet, but the man he had left on the street corner had just reached out and turned off his world. The silence inside the Sterling Manufacturing plant was not peaceful. It was heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of money burning. For the first time in 20 years, the massive hydraulic presses were cold. The conveyor belts, usually a blur of motion carrying high-tech automotive components, sat still like dead snakes coiling through the facility. 500 workers stood in clusters on the factory floor, their arms crossed, their faces tight with worry and anger. They were paid by the hour. If the line did not run, they did not eat. And the line had not moved since the morning shift began because there was no steel to feed it. Up in the glass-walled executive suite that overlooked the floor, Richard Sterling was unraveling. He was a man who had built his entire identity on control, and now he was watching his kingdom paralyze itself. He held the receiver of his office phone so tight his knuckles were white. He was screaming at his procurement director, a man named Miller, who looked like he was about to faint. "Get me Midwest steel," Richard roared. "Get me pending shipments. I do not care what the contract says. Offer them double." Miller shook his head, his voice trembling. "I tried, Mr. Sterling. I called Midwest. I called Heavy Alloy. I even called the suppliers in China. They all said the same thing. Our credit rating has been flagged. The insurance on our accounts receivable has been pulled. They cannot put a single coil on a truck until the flag is lifted." Richard slammed the phone down. It cracked against the mahogany desk. He did not care. He paced the room, his expensive Italian loafers clicking frantically on the hardwood. He looked down at the workers. They were looking up at him. He saw judgment in their eyes. He saw the loss of respect. "This is impossible," Richard hissed to himself. "I am Sterling Manufacturing. I am a pillar of this city. Banks do not just freeze me out. Suppliers do not just ghost me." He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He watched a forklift driver turn off his engine and walk away. The factory was dying, and Richard, in his arrogance, could not accept that it was his own financial mismanagement that had dug this grave. He could not accept that the leverage he had used to buy his penthouse, his cars, and his status was now the very thing choking him. His mind scrambled for a reason. He needed a villain. He needed a cause that was external, something he could attack. He looked at the silent computer screens in the outer office. He thought about the suddenness of the freeze. It was too precise. It was too surgical. "It is him," Richard whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He spun around and pointed a shaking finger at Miller. "It is Kendrick." Miller looked confused. "Your son-in-law, sir? But you fired him. He does not work here anymore." "Exactly," Richard shouted, his eyes wide with paranoid fury. "He knows the systems. He built the supply chain algorithms. He knows the override codes. He is doing this. He is hacking us from the outside. That ungrateful, low-born street rat is sabotaging my legacy to get revenge." Richard grabbed his coat. He did not see the irony. He did not see that he was blaming the only man who had actually kept his factory running efficiently for 5 years. He only saw a target. "Call the security team," Richard ordered. "I want a full sweep of the servers. And get me Vance. Get me the private investigator. I want that boy watched every second of every day. If he so much as touches a keyboard, I want him in handcuffs." While Richard was chasing ghosts in his server room, I was sitting on the porch of my bungalow, watching the snow melt. It was a deceptive calm. I knew exactly what was happening across town. I knew that by now, the second shift would be sent home. I knew that by tomorrow, the rumors of bankruptcy would hit the local papers. Kendrick was inside, helping Leo build a castle out of cardboard boxes. He was still depressed, still beaten down by the rejections, but he was functioning. He did not know that I was the one pulling the strings that were strangling his former boss. He still thought this was just a run of bad luck for Richard. I saw a gray sedan drive slowly past the house. It parked 3 houses down. I recognized the silhouette in the driver's seat. It was Vance, the private eye. Richard was predictable. When he felt cornered, he lashed out. He was looking for dirt. He was looking for evidence that Kendrick was the mastermind. I smiled. I decided to give him a show. I waited until noon. I put on my old canvas jacket and my worn-out baseball cap. I walked out to my truck. I made sure to walk with a slight limp, exaggerating my age. I wanted Vance to see a tired, defeated old man. I drove slowly, checking my rearview mirror. The gray sedan followed me, keeping a professional distance. I drove to the worst part of the downtown district, an area where the buildings were boarded up and the neon signs flickered even in the daylight. I pulled into the parking lot of a small, run-down noodle shop called the Golden Bowl. It was a place with sticky tables and cheap food, the kind of place a man goes when he is counting his last few dollars. I walked inside. The air smelled of star anise and old frying oil. In the back booth, a man was waiting for me. To the untrained eye, he looked like a loan shark. He wore a sharp black suit that looked out of place in the dingy diner. He had slicked back hair and a scar on his cheek. He looked dangerous, but he was not a loan shark. He was Jonathan Wu, the senior vice president of commercial lending for the biggest bank in Chicago. He was also the son of a man I had worked with on the assembly line 40 years ago. I had paid for Jonathan's law school. He was one of the few people who knew exactly who Solomon Hayes really was. I sat down opposite him. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look small. I clasped my hands together on the table, a gesture that looked like pleading. "Jonathan," I said quietly, "thank you for coming to this hole." Jonathan smiled, but kept his face serious. "For you, Mr. Hayes, I would meet in a sewer. How is the play going?" "It is entering the final act," I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a brown paper envelope. It looked like a payoff. It looked like I was handing over cash to save my life. Inside the envelope were the updated transfer deeds for the debt purchase. I was buying another tranche of Sterling's loans. "Take this," I said. "Execute the buy order at closing today." Jonathan took the envelope. He leaned forward. "He is going to default, Solomon. You know that. You are buying toxic assets." "I am not buying the assets," I said. "I am buying the leverage. When he defaults, I want to be the one holding the gavel." Jonathan nodded. He reached out and patted my hand. It was a gesture of respect, of affection. From the window across the street, Vance was snapping photos with a long-range telephoto lens. Through his camera, the scene told a very different story. He saw an old black man in a dirty jacket, hunched over, handing an envelope of cash to a dangerous-looking man in a suit. He saw the suit patting the old man's hand, a gesture that looked like a threat or a patronizing dismissal. Vance smirked. He lowered his camera and dialed Richard Sterling immediately. "Mr. Sterling, you are going to want to see this," Vance said. "I think I found out where they are getting their money, and I think I found their weak spot." Back at the Sterling executive suite, Richard received the photos via email 10 minutes later. He pulled them up on his large monitor. He stared at the grainy image of me and Jonathan in the noodle shop. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a manic, hysterical laugh that startled his secretary outside. "I knew it," Richard crowed. He pointed at the screen. "Look at him. Look at that pathetic posture. That is not a mastermind. That is a desperate old fool begging a loan shark for more time." He zoomed in on the envelope. "He is borrowing money from the mob," Richard said to the empty room. "That $5,000 at the hospital? It was loan shark money. And now he is in deep. He is drowning." The fear that had gripped Richard all morning evaporated, replaced by a surge of cruel confidence. He believed he had found the smoking gun. He believed that Kendrick and I were not hacking him, but that we were criminals, indebted to dangerous people. In his twisted mind, this was better. This was leverage he could use to destroy us publicly. He picked up his phone. He dialed Vance back. "Good work," Richard said. "Keep watching them. If that man in the suit shows up at their house, I want photos. I want to document their descent into the gutter." He hung up and walked to the window. The factory was still silent, but now Richard felt like he had a plan. He would use this. He would go to us. He would present himself not as a failure, but as a savior. He would offer to pay off our dangerous debts, and in exchange, he would take Leo. He would frame it as a rescue mission. He would save his grandson from a life of crime and poverty. He checked his reflection in the glass. He straightened his tie. "Get my car," he barked into the intercom. "I am going to make a house call." He thought he was driving to a victory. He thought he was going to catch a rat in a trap. He had no idea that he was the rat, and the cheese he was chasing was poisoned. I finished my tea at the noodle shop. Jonathan stood up and shook my hand firmly. "Give them hell, Solomon," he said. "I will," I promised. I walked back to my truck. I felt the eyes of the investigator on me. I let my shoulders slump a little more. I let him see a beaten man. I drove home to the south side, knowing that Richard Sterling was coming. I went into the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. I told Kendrick and Victoria to sit at the table. "Why, Dad?" Kendrick asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," I said, pouring 3 cups. "Company is coming, and this time we are going to let him talk." 10 minutes later, the silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb. It looked like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong galaxy. Richard stepped out. He did not bring security this time. He held a manila folder in his hand, the prints of the photos Vance had taken. He walked up the cracked walkway. He did not knock. He pounded on the door with the authority of a landlord. I opened it. Richard stood there, flanked by the gray winter afternoon. He looked past me at Kendrick and Victoria, sitting in the dim kitchen. He smiled. "May I come in?" he asked. "Or do you need to ask your loan officer for permission first?" He pushed past me into the living room. The trap was set. The arrogance of the man was about to be his undoing. He thought he was holding a royal flush. He didn't know we were playing a different game entirely. Richard Sterling stood in my living room, and he made the space feel smaller. It was not because of his physical size, as he was a man of average height with soft hands that had never held a wrench. It was because of the way he looked at the furniture. He scanned the faded plaid sofa, the chipped paint on the baseboards, and the family photos in cheap frames with a look of anthropological curiosity mixed with deep repulsion. He was wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than my truck. He did not take it off. He did not want to stay long enough to get comfortable. Kendrick and Victoria sat at the small kitchen table. They looked like children waiting for the principal to deliver a punishment. I stood by the sink, leaning against the counter, holding a mug of black coffee. I let the silence stretch. I wanted Richard to speak first. I wanted him to lay his cards on the table, so I could see exactly how bad his hand was. Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy slap, sliding across the cracked formica surface until it hit the salt shaker. "I know everything," Richard said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I saw the pictures, Solomon. I know you are in deep with the loan sharks." He looked at me with a smirk. He thought the meeting with Jonathan Wu was a desperate plea for money. He thought the cash at the hospital was dirty. He had constructed a narrative in his head where he was the hero coming to save his daughter from a criminal family. I said nothing. I just sipped my coffee. Richard turned his attention to Kendrick. He opened the folder and spread 3 documents out on the table. They were legal forms, crisp and white, the ink still smelling fresh. "I am a reasonable man," Richard said, smoothing his tie. "I do not want my grandson growing up in a house where the grandfather owes money to the mob. I do not want my daughter living in squalor, so I have prepared a solution. It is a generous offer, considering the circumstances." Kendrick looked at the papers. His eyes scanned the legal jargon. I saw his jaw tighten. I saw the vein in his temple pulse. He looked up at Richard, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is a divorce decree," Kendrick whispered. Richard nodded. "Uncontested. You sign it. You waive all rights to marital assets. You waive all rights to alimony. And most importantly, you waive all custodial rights to Leo." Victoria gasped. She reached for the paper, but Richard slapped his hand down on it. "Read the rest," Richard commanded. Kendrick read the second document. His voice shook. "You want me to sign away my son. You want full custody to go to Victoria, with you named as the primary financial guardian. And I get nothing. No visitation, no contact. Not nothing," Richard corrected. "Look at the 3rd page. That is the sweetener." Kendrick looked. He read it out loud, his voice rising in anger. "In exchange for the full termination of parental rights, Richard Sterling agrees to pay off the $50,000 gambling debt of Solomon Hayes. Furthermore, Richard Sterling agrees to employ Kendrick Hayes as a Level 1 security associate at the Sterling Manufacturing employee parking lot." The room went dead silent. The insult was so precise, so calculated, that it took a moment to fully process. Richard was not just asking Kendrick to leave. He was asking him to sell his son to pay for his father's imaginary crimes. And then, he was offering him a job guarding the cars of the very people Kendrick used to manage. He wanted to put Kendrick in a uniform and make him watch the world he used to belong to from the outside. Kendrick stood up. The chair scraped violently against the linoleum. He made a fist. He was 32 years old, strong, and filled with a rage that could kill a man. He took a step toward Richard. "You think you can buy my son?" Kendrick roared. "You think you can turn me into your doorman?" Richard did not flinch. He looked bored. "I think you are broke, Kendrick. I think your father is one missed payment away from having his legs broken by the mob. I am offering you a lifeline. You get out of debt, you get a job, and Leo gets to grow up in a mansion instead of this dump." Kendrick lunged. I moved faster than I had in 20 years. I crossed the kitchen in 2 strides. I grabbed Kendrick by the shoulder. My grip was hard, my fingers digging into his muscle. I pulled him back. I put my body between him and Richard. "Stand down," I said. My voice was low, guttural. "Dad, let me go," Kendrick shouted, struggling against my grip. "He is trying to steal Leo." "I know," I said, "but we do not fight him with fists, not today." I pushed Kendrick back into his chair. I turned to face Richard. We were eye to eye. I could smell his expensive cologne. It smelled like lavender and arrogance. He looked at me with pity. He thought I was stopping Kendrick because I wanted the deal. He thought I wanted the $50,000 to save my own skin. Richard smiled. "Smart move, Solomon. You know when you are beaten." I picked up the contract. I looked at the clauses. I looked at the part where it valued my debt at $50,000. I looked at the part where it stripped my son of his dignity. "I have a question," I said. "Ask away," Richard said, checking his gold watch. "I have a dinner reservation at 7. I pointed to the custody clause. "You are offering $50,000 to clear my debt in exchange for your grandson. Is that the valuation?" Richard laughed. He buttoned his coat. "Let us be honest, Solomon. 50,000 is a premium. I am paying for the convenience of a clean break. If we went to court, I could probably get the boy for free, considering your criminal associations. But I am paying extra to scrub the stain out of the family history quickly. So, $50,000, I repeated. That is what you think a Hayes is worth." Richard shrugged. "For a bloodline that ends up working in parking lots? Yes, I would say that is generous. I am paying for the potential Leo has, not the genetic baggage he carries from your side." I looked at him. I memorized his face. I memorized the way his lip curled when he said the word genetic. I memorized the look of absolute superiority in his eyes. He truly believed he was a different species. He believed money had changed his DNA. I folded the contract. I did not rip it. I did not throw it in his face. I folded it neatly and placed it in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. "We will not be signing this today," I said. Richard's smile faded. "Then the deal is off. And when the loan sharks come for you, do not call me. And when the police come for Kendrick for child neglect, do not expect mercy. I am not asking for mercy, Richard. I am just keeping this paperwork." "Why?" Richard asked, annoyed. "Because I like to keep receipts," I said. Richard scoffed. He shook his head in disbelief. "You are a fool, Solomon. You had a chance to walk away with a clean slate. Now, you will walk away with nothing." He turned to Victoria. "Are you coming, or are you staying with the losers?" Victoria looked at the divorce papers on the table. She looked at Kendrick, who was burying his face in his hands. She looked at me. Then she looked at her father. "Get out," Victoria whispered. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I said get out!" Victoria screamed. She stood up, knocking her chair over. "You tried to buy my son. You tried to buy my husband. You are sick. Get out of this house." Richard sneered. "Fine, have it your way. Starve together. It makes no difference to me." He turned on his heel and walked out the front door. He did not close it behind him, leaving it wide open to the winter cold. I walked over and shut it. I locked the deadbolt. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. I wanted to watch him leave. I saw him walking down the cracked path to his silver Mercedes. He looked angry, but confident. He was pulling his cell phone out of his pocket, probably to call his lawyers and start the hostile custody battle he had threatened. I watched him unlock his car. I watched him get in. I watched him hold the phone to his ear. And then, I watched his world end. Even from 30 feet away, through a frosted window, I saw the change. Richard had just started the car when the call connected. He did not get to speak. He listened. I saw his face go slack. I saw the color drain out of his skin, leaving him looking gray and old. He dropped the phone into his lap. He sat there, staring through the windshield at nothing. He did not put the car in gear. He just sat there, mouth slightly open, looking like a man who had just been told he had terminal cancer. Inside the kitchen, Kendrick was raging. He was tearing up the duplicate copies of the contract. He was swearing revenge. "Dad, we have to kill him," Kendrick sobbed. "We have to do something." I turned away from the window. I walked back to the table. I put a hand on Kendrick's shoulder. "It is done," I said quietly. "What is done?" Kendrick asked, confused. I pointed to the window. "Look." Kendrick walked to the window. He saw Richard sitting in the driveway, frozen. "What is wrong with him?" Kendrick asked. I sat down and took a sip of my coffee. It was cold now, but it tasted sweet. "Right now," I said, "Richard is on the phone with his bank. He is being told that his request to roll over his $50 million operating loan has been denied." Kendrick stared at me. "How do you know that?" "Because," I said, putting my mug down, "the bank did not just deny him. They told him that the debt has been sold. They told him that a private holding company bought the note this morning." Kendrick turned around slowly. His eyes were wide. "What holding company, Dad?" I tapped the pocket of my shirt, right where I had put the insulting contract. "A company called Ouroboros Logistics," I said. Kendrick frowned. "I know that name. That is the shell company that holds the patents for the—" He stopped. He looked at the garage where I kept my old drawings. He looked at the dirty flannel shirt I was wearing. He looked at the man he thought was just a mechanic. The gears in his engineer's brain finally clicked into place. The patents, the royalties, the trust, the cash at the hospital, the meeting with the man in the suit. "David," Kendrick whispered, "you own Ouroboros?" I nodded. "That means—" Kendrick's voice trailed off. "That means I own his debt," I finished. "I own his factory. I own his machines. And as of 5 minutes ago, I own the mortgage on the house he kicked you out of." Outside, Richard Sterling finally put his car in gear. He backed out of the driveway erratically, almost hitting the mailbox. He sped away, driving like a man escaping a burning building. But he could not escape. The fire was in his bank account, and I was holding the matches. I looked at the contract in my pocket. He valued my bloodline at $50,000. He was about to find out that my bloodline cost $50 million, and payment was due immediately. The phone on the kitchen wall rang with a shrill, demanding tone that made everyone jump. It was 6 in the evening. Outside, the winter darkness had settled over the south side, turning the snow into dirty slush. Inside, the mood was just as bleak. Victoria stared at the phone as if it were a bomb. She knew who it was. Richard Sterling did not text. He did not email. He commanded. She picked up the receiver and put it on speaker. Her hand was shaking so badly that the plastic rattled against the table. "Hello, Father," she whispered. "Victoria!" Richard's voice barked into the room, tinny and distorted but full of venom. "I assume you have come to your senses. The gala starts in 2 hours. I have sent a car for you. It will be there in 45 minutes. Victoria looked at Kendrick. She looked at me. She swallowed hard. "I cannot come, Dad. I am staying with my husband." There was a silence on the line. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a predator calculating its next strike. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "The investors are nervous. The rumors about the supply chain freeze are spreading. I need to show them stability. I need to show them family. You are going to be there. You are going to wear the red dress I bought you, and you are going to smile at the senator's son, Michael. He is a good match for you. He comes from a worthy bloodline." Victoria began to cry silently. "You want me to date someone else? I am married, Dad." "You are married to a failure who is currently burying you in debt," Richard snapped. "If you do not walk through those doors tonight, Victoria, I will remove you from the trust completely. I will cut off your health insurance. I will make sure you never see a dime of the Sterling inheritance. Do you want your son to grow up in that mechanic's shack forever?" Kendrick stood up. He leaned toward the phone. "She is not coming, Richard, and neither am I." Richard laughed. It was a dry, cruel sound. "Oh, I know you are not coming, Kendrick. You are not invited. Security has your photo. If you step foot on the property, you will be arrested for trespassing. This is for the elite, not for the help." "Victoria, the car is waiting. Do not test me." The line went dead. Victoria dropped the phone. She buried her face in her hands. "He means it," she sobbed. "He will cut us off. He will ruin Leo's future just to spite us. I have to go. I have to go and beg him to stop." Kendrick looked at her, his eyes full of pain. He did not scream. He did not fight. He looked defeated. He looked like a man who accepted that he was too small to fight a giant. "Go," Kendrick whispered. "Go if you have to. I cannot stop you." The air in the kitchen felt heavy, suffocating with the weight of submission. They were breaking. Richard was winning without even being in the room. He was using their fear of poverty to crush their loyalty. I slammed my coffee mug down on the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. "Enough," I said. Kendrick and Victoria looked up, startled. "No one is going to beg," I said, my voice filling the small room. "And no one is going alone." I walked past them, out of the kitchen, and down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. At the back of the room stood a tall, oak wardrobe. It was locked. It had been locked for 20 years. To Kendrick, it was just a dusty piece of furniture where I kept old coats. He did not know that it was a time capsule. I pulled a small brass key from the chain around my neck. I inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked smoothly. I swung the heavy doors open. The smell of cedar and lavender wafted out, masking the scent of the old house. Hanging inside, protected by heavy garment bags, were 3 suits. They were not department store suits. They were bespoke tuxedos, hand-tailored in Milan in the late 90s, back when I was dining with governors and shipping magnates. I pulled the zippers down. The fabric caught the dim light of the bedroom. Midnight blue wool, black satin lapels, silk linings. They were armor. They were the uniforms of power that I had shed when I chose a simpler life. I took them off the hangers. I walked back into the living room and threw them onto the sofa. "Put them on," I ordered. Kendrick stared at the tuxedo. He touched the fabric. It was soft, luxurious, heavier than anything he had ever owned. "Dad, what is this? Where did you get these?" "From a life I left behind," I said. "But tonight, I am reclaiming it." "But Richard said, I am not invited," Kendrick stammered. "He said security will arrest me." I walked over to my son. I gripped his shoulders. I looked him dead in the eye. "Richard thinks he is the king of the jungle because he roars the loudest," I said. "But he is just a hyena. He does not know that the lion has returned. You are not going as his former employee. You are going as my son. And tonight, we do not ask for permission to enter. We take our seats at the head of the table." I turned to Victoria. She was wiping her eyes, looking at the 3rd garment bag. It was a dress, a vintage black velvet gown that had belonged to my late wife. It was elegant, timeless, and regal. "Wear this," I told her. "The red dress is a costume he bought for his puppet. This dress is for a queen. If you walk into that room wearing his clothes, he owns you. If you walk in wearing this, you own yourself." Victoria touched the velvet. Her tears stopped. She looked from the dress to me. For the first time, she did not see a poor father-in-law. She saw a patriarch. She saw a general rallying his troops. "We have 1 hour," I said. "Get dressed. Tonight, we hunt." 45 minutes later, we stood in the living room. The transformation was absolute. Kendrick looked taller. The tuxedo fit him perfectly, accentuating his broad shoulders. He adjusted his cufflinks, his hands steady. He looked like a man who controlled billions. Victoria looked stunning, the black velvet making her skin glow, her head held high. And I put on my own tuxedo. It was a little tight around the waist, but it still fit. I tied my bow tie without a mirror. My fingers remembered the motion. We did not wait for Richard's car. I called a private service. When the black SUV pulled up, we did not run to it. We walked. The Grand Hotel was a fortress of light in the center of the city. Limousines lined the driveway, dropping off the city's elite. Men in $5,000 suits and women in diamonds stepped onto the red carpet, flashing smiles for the press. This was Richard's world. It was a world of surface and shine. Our SUV pulled up to the entrance. We stepped out. The flashbulbs popped, then paused. The photographers were confused. They did not recognize us immediately, but they recognized the aura. We moved with a synchronized purpose. We were a phalanx. We walked up the red carpet toward the massive revolving doors. 2 large security guards in earpieces stepped forward to block our path. They crossed their arms. They saw 3 black faces that were not on the VIP list. They saw intruders. "Excuse me," the lead guard grunted, placing a heavy hand on my chest. "This is a private event, invitation only." I stopped. I looked at his hand on my tuxedo. I did not brush it away. I simply looked at it, then up at his eyes. "Remove your hand," I said softly, "before you lose it." The guard blinked. He was used to people arguing, begging, or yelling. He was not used to absolute, icy calm. He hesitated, but he did not move. "Sir," I need to see a pass, or you need to turn around. Mr. Sterling has given us strict instructions regarding—" He stopped talking because I stopped looking at him. I looked past him, into the lobby. Through the glass, I saw a man in a pristine tailcoat pacing nervously near the elevators. It was Henri, the general manager of the Grand Hotel. Henri was a legend in the hospitality industry. He had started as a bellboy 30 years ago. I had paid for his mother's surgery when I was staying at this hotel for a month during a merger. He had never forgotten. "Henri," I said. My voice was not loud, but it projected. The man inside turned. He squinted through the glass. Then his eyes went wide. He dropped the clipboard he was holding. He ran. He did not walk. The general manager of the most expensive hotel in Chicago ran across the lobby, pushing past a senator and a tech CEO. He burst through the doors. The security guard looked back, startled. Henri stopped in front of me. He was breathless. He looked at my face, aged by time, but unchanged in spirit. He looked at the tuxedo. He looked at the family standing behind me. He bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, 90-degree bow of profound respect. "Monsieur Hayes," Henri gasped. It has been an eternity." The security guard dropped his hand as if he had touched a hot stove. He stepped back, his face draining of color. He had never seen his boss bow to anyone, not even the mayor. Henri straightened up. His eyes were wet. "Welcome home, monsieur." "We did not know you were coming. If I had known, it was a last-minute decision, Henry," I said, smiling. "Is the ballroom open?" "For you, Monsieur Hayes, the entire hotel is open," Henry said. He turned to the security guards. His voice turned to steel. "Escort Mr. Hayes and his family to the diamond table, immediately, and if anyone stops them, you are fired." The guards scrambled to open the doors. We walked into the lobby. The air was warm and smelled of expensive lilies. The murmur of the crowd died down as we passed. People turned to look. They whispered, "Who is that? Is that a diplomat? Is that royalty?" Far above us, on the mezzanine balcony that overlooked the lobby, Richard Sterling stood holding a martini. He was laughing with a group of investors, trying to project confidence despite the panic eating at his gut. He looked down when the noise of the lobby changed. He saw the general manager bowing. He saw the security guards parting the crowd like the Red Sea. He saw 3 figures walking toward the ballroom with an air of absolute command. From this distance, and through the haze of his third martini, he did not recognize us. He saw the tuxedos. He saw the respect. "Ah," Richard said to the investors, pointing down. "That must be the senator and his family. Look at how Henri greets them. That is the kind of power we associate with." He took a sip of his drink, feeling smug. He thought his saviors had arrived. He thought the night was going to be a triumph. He watched the group disappear into the ballroom. He adjusted his tie. "Come, gentlemen," Richard said. "Let us go down and welcome our distinguished guests." He began to walk down the grand staircase. He was walking to his own execution, and he was smiling the whole way. He did not know that the senator he was rushing to greet was the man whose car he had spit on 24 hours ago. He did not know that the senator's son was the boy he had called a dog. I walked into the ballroom. The chandeliers were blinding. The music was loud, but all I could hear was the sound of the trap snapping shut. The hunt had begun. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a sea of diamonds and deceit. Waiters moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of champagne that cost more than my monthly pension. I stood in the back of the room, hidden by the shadows of a marble pillar, flanked by my son and daughter-in-law. Kendrick looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with his cufflinks, but Victoria stood tall in the black velvet dress. She was watching her father on the stage, and for the first time, her eyes held no affection, only a cold, hard clarity. Richard Sterling stood at the podium, bathed in a spotlight that was far too bright for a man with so many dark secrets. He looked impeccable in his tuxedo, his silver hair gleaming, his smile practiced and wide. But I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. I could see the way his hand gripped the microphone stand a little too tightly. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to convince the world that he was learning to fly. He raised a glass, and the room went silent. 300 of Chicago's elite turned their faces toward him. They were investors, politicians, and socialites, people who measured worth in stock options and summer homes. They hung on his every word, unaware that they were listening to a corpse. "My friends," Richard began, his voice booming through the speakers, "we live in difficult times. The market is volatile. The world is changing. But there is one thing that remains constant, one thing that anchors us against the storm, and that is family." He paused for effect. A ripple of polite applause moved through the room. I felt Kendrick stiffen beside me. The audacity of this man to speak of family while his grandson slept in a house with a broken furnace was breathtaking. "But not all family is created equal," Richard continued, his tone shifting to something darker, more conspiratorial. "To build a legacy, one must be willing to make hard choices. A gardener must prune the dead branches so the tree can survive. A CEO must cut the dead weight so the company can thrive." He looked out into the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces, looking for validation. "Recently, I had to make a painful decision regarding my own circle," Richard said, feigning sadness. "I had to sever ties with those who did not share our values, those who sought to feed off our success without contributing to it. We all know the type, the parasites, the ones who come from nothing and think they are entitled to everything simply because they married into it." The room gasped softly. Everyone knew who he was talking about. He was publicly flaying Kendrick, stripping him of his dignity in front of the very people he had worked with for 5 years. He was painting my son as a leech, a gold digger who had been cast out for his own incompetence. Kendrick made a noise in his throat, a sound of pure anguish. He started to step forward, but I put a hand on his chest. "Not yet," I whispered. "Let him finish digging the grave." Richard smiled, emboldened by the silence of the room. He thought he had won. He thought he had controlled the narrative. "But tonight is about the future," Richard declared, raising his voice. "Tonight, I am proud to announce a new era for Sterling Manufacturing. We are strong, we are solvent, and we are pure. To the Sterling legacy." He raised his glass high. The crowd began to clap. "Now," I signaled Henry. The general manager was standing by the lighting booth. He saw my nod. He flipped a master switch. The ballroom plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The applause died instantly. Gasps and murmurs of confusion filled the air. A woman screamed faintly. The music stopped. For 10 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of 300 wealthy people holding their breath in the dark. Then, a single spotlight clicked on. It did not hit the podium where Richard was standing. It hit the space directly next to him. I was there. I had moved through the darkness with the silence of a man who had spent his life in the background. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Richard Sterling. I was wearing my midnight blue tuxedo, my back straight, my head high. I looked out at the blinded audience, my face calm, my eyes burning with a quiet fire. Richard jumped back as if he had seen a ghost. He dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the stage, the sound amplifying through the microphone like an explosion. He stared at me. He blinked, trying to process how the old mechanic from the South Side was standing next to him in a bespoke Italian suit. He looked at the audience, then back at me. Panic seized him. "Security!" Richard shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get him off the stage. This man is a trespasser. Security!" He pointed a trembling finger at me. He looked toward the doors where the large guards were stationed. He expected them to rush forward. He expected them to tackle me, to drag me out by my collar, to restore his delusion of power. Nothing happened. The guards stood by the doors, their arms crossed, their faces stone. They looked at Richard, then they looked at me. They did not move a muscle. They had their orders, and those orders did not come from a man whose credit rating had just hit 0. Richard screamed again. "Are you deaf? I pay your salaries. Remove this filth from my stage immediately." I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. Richard tried to grab it, but I caught his wrist. My hand was a mechanic's hand, strong and calloused. I squeezed, not enough to break bone, but enough to paralyze him. He gasped in pain and let go. I stepped forward. The spotlight widened to include me fully. I looked out at the sea of faces. I did not need notes. I did not need a teleprompter. I had been writing this speech in my head for 30 years. "Mr. Sterling calls for security," I said, my voice deep and resonant, filling every corner of the room. But there is no security here for him, not anymore. The room was so quiet, You could hear the ice melting in the buckets. "Richard," I said, turning to face him, "you spoke eloquently about parasites. You spoke about dead branches. You spoke about people who feed off the success of others without contributing." I took a step closer to him. He shrank back, terrified by the authority radiating from me. "I agree with you," I said. "Parasites are a problem. But you made a critical error in your diagnosis. You identified the wrong organism." I turned back to the crowd. "My name is Solomon Hayes," I announced. "Most of you do not know me. You see a black man in a tuxedo, and you wonder if I am the entertainment. You wonder if I am the help." I paused. "I am neither. I am the reason you are all drinking champagne tonight." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I pointed it at the massive projection screen behind the stage, which still displayed the Sterling Manufacturing logo. I clicked the button. The logo vanished. In its place, a complex financial diagram appeared. It was a spiderweb of numbers, lines, and accounts. It was a balance sheet, but it was bleeding red ink. "This is the real financial state of Sterling Manufacturing," I said, using the remote to highlight a steep downward curve. The crowd murmured. People in the front row squinted, reading the numbers. "For the last 10 years, I explained, my voice steady and clinical, this company has not made a profit, not a single dime. The manufacturing costs have skyrocketed. The quality control has plummeted. The only reason this company has not filed for bankruptcy a decade ago is because of a single silent investor who has been injecting capital to cover the losses." I clicked the remote again. A new graphic appeared. It showed a massive pipeline of money flowing from a mysterious entity into the Sterling accounts. "This entity," I said, pointing to the screen, "is a private equity firm called Aurora Holdings." Richard went pale. He knew the name. Everyone in the room knew the name. Aurora Holdings was a ghost in the industry, a massive silent whale that owned shipping lanes, warehouses, and patent portfolios. Richard had bragged for years that he had a special partnership with Aurora. He claimed they invested in him because of his genius. "You told your board that Aurora believed in your vision," I said to Richard. "You told them that Aurora was a strategic partner." Richard stammered. He looked for an exit, but there was none. "Yes, they are. They are my partners. They trust me." I clicked the remote one last time. The screen changed. The logo of Aurora Holdings appeared. It was a golden sunrise. Then, the corporate structure dissolved to reveal the single, sole proprietor of the firm. The name on the screen was written in bold, black letters, Solomon Hayes. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was a physical sound, a shock wave. Men in suits dropped their jaws. Women covered their mouths. They looked from the screen to the old man standing on the stage. They looked at Richard. He was staring at the screen, his eyes bulging. He shook his head. "No, no, that is impossible. You are a mechanic. You fix trucks. You live in the ghetto." "I am a mechanic," I said softly. "I fix things that are broken. And 10 years ago, when your father died and left you this company, you broke it. You ran it into the ground with your arrogance and your spending. I stepped in. I bought your debt. I covered your payroll." "Why?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling with horror. "Why would you do that?" "Because my son worked for you," I said. "Because I wanted him to have a future. Because I thought that if I supported you from the shadows, you might eventually learn how to be a leader. I thought you might learn gratitude." I turned to the audience. But instead of gratitude, I found contempt. Instead of leadership, I found a man who freezes the bank accounts of his own children. A man who throws a 5-year-old boy out into the snow because he thinks his blood is too precious for commoners. I looked at Kendrick and Victoria in the back of the room. "My son is not a parasite, Richard," I thundered. "He is the host. He is the one who optimized your supply chains. He is the one who kept your factory running while you were playing golf. And I am the root. I am the money. I am the steel. I am the very ground you stand on." I walked over to Richard. He was trembling violently now. He looked small. He looked like a child who had been caught stealing. "You wanted to prune the dead branches," I said, leaning in close so the microphone caught every syllable. "I agree. The tree is dying, Richard, and it is time to cut off the rot." I reached into my inner pocket. I pulled out a legal document. It was not a prop. It was the foreclosure notice I had prepared with Reynolds an hour ago. I slapped the document against his chest. He grabbed it reflexively. "As the sole owner of your debt, and as the primary shareholder of the holding company that owns your mortgage, I am calling in the loan," I declared. Richard looked at the paper. He looked at the crowd. They were not looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with disgust. They were looking at a fraud. "You are in default," I said. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as CEO. Your assets are frozen. Your access to the building is revoked." I turned to the security guards. "Gentlemen," I said, "please escort Mr. Sterling off the premises. He is trespassing." The guards moved. They did not hesitate. They marched onto the stage, their heavy boots thudding on the wood. They grabbed Richard by the arms. "No!" Richard screamed, struggling weakly. "You cannot do this. I am Sterling. This is my company. This is my life." I watched him. I felt no joy. I felt no thrill of victory. I only felt the heavy, solemn weight of justice. "It was your life," I said, "until you decided that my family was not worth living in it." The guards dragged him away. He kicked and shouted, his tuxedo bunching up, his dignity shredded. The crowd parted to let them pass, recoiling from him as if he were diseased. I stood alone on the stage. The spotlight was warm. I looked at the silence. I looked at the people who had judged me when I walked in. Now, they looked at me with fear and reverence. I adjusted my tie. I looked at the screen where my name still glowed in giant letters. "I am Solomon Hayes," I said to the room, "and the bar is open." I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a thud that sounded like the final nail in a coffin. I walked off the stage, down the steps, and toward my son. The room erupted into chaos, but I did not look back. The hunt was over. The lion had eaten. Richard Sterling stood on the stage, and he looked like a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a paper umbrella. The giant screen behind him glowed with the undeniable truth of his financial ruin. But his arrogance was a stubborn thing. It refused to die quietly. He gripped the podium with sweaty hands, his knuckles turning white, and he tried to laugh. It was a jagged, desperate sound that echoed uncomfortably in the silent ballroom. "This is a trick," Richard stammered, his eyes darting around the room, pleading for an ally. "This is a digital fabrication. This man is a mechanic. He is a fraud. He has hacked the system. Do not believe a word he says." He looked at the investors in the front row. These were men he had played golf with for years, men who had eaten at his table. "Tell him," Richard begged, pointing at a bank president. "Tell him that Sterling Manufacturing is a fortress. Tell him about our profits." The bank president looked down at his shoes. He did not speak. The silence was the answer. I watched Richard unravel. It was not a pleasant sight, but it was a necessary one. He was trying to rewrite reality in real time. He was trying to use his status as a shield, but the shield was made of glass, and I had a sledgehammer. "You call me a fraud, Richard," I said, my voice calm and amplified by the microphone in my hand. "You say I am just a mechanic. You are right about one thing. I am a mechanic. But you forgot what a mechanic actually does. We look under the hood. We see the rust that you paint over, and we know exactly when the engine is about to blow." I pressed the button on the remote control one more time. The financial spreadsheet on the screen vanished. It was replaced by a photograph. It was an old, grainy image, taken in black and white 30 years ago. The resolution was low, but the subject was unmistakable. The photo showed a small, cluttered office. It was my office, back when I ran my logistics company out of a converted warehouse. There were two men in the photo. One was me, sitting behind a desk covered in blueprints, looking young and strong. The other man was kneeling on the floor. He was weeping. His hands were clasped together in a posture of absolute begging. That man was Richard Sterling. The crowd gasped. The image was shocking. It stripped away 30 years of Richard's carefully cultivated image of power and nobility. It showed him as he truly was, weak, desperate, broken. Richard turned around and saw the photo. He let out a strangled cry. He reached up as if he could tear the image off the screen with his bare hands. "Turn it off," Richard screamed. "Turn it off right now." I did not turn it off. I let it burn into the retinas of everyone in the room. "Do you remember this day, Richard?" I asked. It was raining, November 4th, 1994. You had just gambled away the startup capital your father gave you on a risky futures bet. You were facing jail time for embezzlement. You came to me. You came to the man whose bloodline you now call unworthy. I walked closer to him. He could not look at me. He was staring at the floor, shaking. You begged me for a loan, I continued, my voice hard as iron. You told me that if I helped you, you would never forget it. You told me that I was the only decent man in this city. I wrote you a check for $200,000. I saved you from prison. I saved your reputation. I gave you the foundation to build everything you have today. I pointed a finger at the photo, then at Kendrick standing in the back of the room. You talk about bloodlines, Richard. You talk about genetic superiority. But look at the evidence. The bloodline that you spent all night insulting is the only reason you are not sitting in a cell right now. The man you called a dog is the son of the man who fed you when you were starving. I turned to the audience. My son Kendrick carries the blood of a man who builds. Richard Sterling carries the blood of a man who begs. You tell me which one is worthy. The room erupted into whispers. The narrative had flipped completely. Richard was no longer the victim of a hostile takeover. He was the villain in a tragedy of his own making. He was the ungrateful beneficiary who had bitten the hand that fed him. Richard looked up. His eyes were red. He looked at me with pure hatred. I paid you back, he hissed. I paid back the loan. I owe you nothing. You paid back the principal, I corrected him. But you never paid back the respect. And today, I am collecting the interest. I reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo. I pulled out a thick blue document bound in legal tape. It was the document I had signed with my lawyers just hours ago. It was the death warrant of his career. I held the document up so the light caught the official seal. You are right that the original loan is closed, I said. But this is not about the past. This is about the present. This is about the $50 million in operating debt that you have accumulated over the last decade while pretending to be a genius. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Richard backed away until he bumped into the podium. He was trapped. As the sole proprietor of Ouroboros Logistics and the primary shareholder of the Aurora Fund, I officially hold 80% of the outstanding debt of Sterling Manufacturing, I announced. I opened the document to the final page. Your loan agreements have a specific clause, Richard. Clause 4A, the insolvency protocol. It states that if the borrower's debt-to-equity ratio exceeds a certain threshold, the primary lender has the right to convert that debt into controlling equity. I looked him in the eye. Your ratio is not just over the threshold, it is in the stratosphere. You are bankrupt, Richard. Richard shook his head frantically. No, you cannot do this. I have assets. I have the patents. You have nothing, I said, cutting him off. The patents belong to the company, and the company belongs to the debt holder. I slapped the document onto the podium. I am exercising the option, I declared. As of this moment, I am converting my debt into 80% ownership of Sterling Manufacturing. I am taking the company. The silence in the room was absolute. This was a hostile takeover happening live on stage. It was a corporate execution. I turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, as the new majority owner, I have my first announcement to make regarding personnel. I pointed at Richard. Richard Sterling, you are fired. Richard's knees buckled. He grabbed the podium to stop himself from falling. He looked like he had been shot. Fired, he whispered. You cannot fire me. I am Sterling. My name is on the building. We will change the sign, I said coldly. I leaned in close to him, so close that only he in the front row could hear the steel in my voice. You have 1 hour to clear out your office, I said. You will be escorted by security. You will take your personal photos and your coat. That is all. I paused, letting the next words sink in. And Richard, do not take a stapler. Do not take a pen. Do not take a single paperclip, because those assets now belong to my son, Kendrick Hayes. And if you steal so much as a post-it note from him, I will prosecute you for theft. Richard looked past me at Kendrick. Kendrick was standing tall, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. He watched his father destroy the monster that had tormented him. He saw the justice he thought would never come. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to beg, but no sound came out. He was done. But the night was not over. The double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. This time, it was not hotel staff. It was not private security. 6 men in windbreakers walked in. On the back of their jackets, in bright yellow letters, were the words Economic Crimes Unit. They moved with the heavy, purposeful stride of law enforcement. They did not look at the guests. They walked straight down the center aisle toward the stage. Richard saw them. His face went from pale to gray. He knew who they were. He knew what they wanted. In the interrogation room earlier that morning, when Detective Miller had accused me of laundering money, I had done more than just prove my innocence. I had given Chief Henderson a tip. I had told him to look at the books of Sterling Manufacturing. I had told him that the reason Richard had so much cash flow, despite no profits, was because he was cooking the books to hide tax evasion. He was using the company accounts to pay for his personal lifestyle and writing it off as business expenses. The lead agent walked up the stairs onto the stage. He stopped in front of Richard. "Richard Sterling," the agent said, his voice flat and professional. Richard looked at the agent, then at me. "Help me," he whispered. "Solomon, please, do not let them take me." I looked at him. I thought about my grandson shivering in the snow. I thought about the inhaler hitting the pavement. "You made your bed, Richard," I said. "Now you have to sleep in it." The agent pulled out a pair of handcuffs. They were silver and cold, just like the ones Richard had tried to put on me. "Mr. Sterling, you are under arrest for tax fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement," the agent said. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Richard did not move. He stood frozen in shock. The agent did not wait. He grabbed Richard's arm and spun him around. He clicked the cuffs onto Richard's wrists. The sound was distinct. Click, click. The audience watched in mesmerized horror. The man who had started the evening as a king was now leaving as a prisoner. The agents began to lead him away. Richard stumbled. He looked frantic. He looked for his daughter. "Victoria!" he screamed. "Victoria, tell them! Call the lawyers! Do something!" Victoria stepped out from the crowd. She stood in the center of the aisle, blocking the path of the police for a brief second. Richard's eyes lit up with hope. He thought she was going to save him. Victoria looked at her father. She looked at the handcuffs. She looked at the tuxedo he was wearing, a suit bought with stolen money. She reached into her purse. She pulled out a set of keys. They were the keys to the penthouse Richard had kicked her out of. She walked up to him. She did not cry. She placed the keys in the breast pocket of his jacket. "You do not need these where you are going, Dad," she said softly. She stepped aside. The agents pushed Richard forward. He was weeping now, ugly, heaving sobs that echoed through the ballroom. He was dragged out of the light, into the darkness of the corridor, leaving behind a legacy of shame. I stood alone on the stage once more. The room was silent. The screen behind me still showed the name Solomon Hayes. I picked up the microphone one last time. I looked at the crowd. They were terrified. They were waiting to see what the new king would do. I looked at Kendrick. I motioned for him to come up. He walked up the stairs. He stood next to me. He looked at the crowd. He looked like a CEO. I handed him the microphone. "It is your company now, son," I said. "Fix it." I walked off the stage. I walked through the crowd. I walked out of the hotel into the cold night air. I took a deep breath. The air tasted like snow and exhaust fumes. But to me, it tasted like victory. I had not just won a battle. I had cleared the board. And now, finally, my family could sleep in peace. The handcuffs clicked shut, but the sound did not bring silence. It brought an explosion of raw, animalistic fury. Richard Sterling had spent 60 years believing he was a god, untouchable and supreme. Now, facing the reality of a jail cell and total bankruptcy, his mind simply snapped. The facade of the civilized CEO crumbled, revealing the cornered beast underneath. He let out a roar that did not sound human. It was a guttural scream of pure hatred. He wrenched his arms violently, catching the agents off guard. The metal cuffs bit into his wrists, drawing blood, but he did not care. He spun around, his eyes locking onto me. He did not see the police. He did not see the crowd. He only saw the man who had taken his kingdom. "I will kill you," Richard screamed, spit flying from his mouth. He lowered his shoulder and charged. He moved with the desperate, flailing energy of a man with nothing left to lose. The agents shouted and reached for him, but he was fueled by adrenaline. He broke through their grasp. He was 10 feet away from me, then 5. I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood on the stage, watching him come, knowing that his time had already run out. But before he could reach me, a shadow moved across my field of vision. It was not a security guard. It was not a police officer. It was my son. Kendrick stepped in front of me. He did not look frantic. He looked bored. He moved with a calm, fluid precision that he had never shown before. He planted his feet. He raised one hand, just one. When Richard collided with him, it was like watching a wave crash against a cliff. Kendrick caught Richard by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. He did not stumble. He did not sway. He absorbed the impact of the older man's rage and simply stopped it cold. Richard flailed, trying to claw at Kendrick's face, but Kendrick's arm was a steel bar keeping him at bay. Kendrick looked into the eyes of the man who had tormented him for 5 years. He saw the fear behind the anger. "Is that all you have?" Kendrick asked softly. He shoved. It was not a violent push. It was a dismissive one. Richard stumbled backward. His expensive Italian loafers slipped on the polished stage floor. He fell hard, landing on his backside in a heap of tangled limbs and humiliation. The room gasped. The great Richard Sterling was on the floor, looking up at the son-in-law he had called a dog. Kendrick brushed off the sleeve of his jacket. He smoothed the lapel where Richard's sweaty hands had grabbed him. He looked down at Richard with a look of absolute, icy indifference. "Get up," Kendrick said, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. "And stay away from me. You are getting dirt on my suit." The line hit Richard harder than any punch could have. It was a mirror of the insult he had thrown at us in the park. "Don't scratch my floors. Don't dirty my house." Now, the roles were reversed. He was the dirt, and Kendrick was the one worried about contamination. Richard lay there, panting, staring up at the man he had underestimated. The police agents rushed forward, grabbing Richard by the arms and hauling him to his feet. They were not gentle this time. They tightened their grip, pinning him against the podium. Richard looked around wildly. He realized physical force had failed. He realized intimidation had failed. He needed a lifeline. He needed an emotional lever to pull. His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on the one person he thought he still owned. "Victoria!" Richard screamed. His voice was shrill, desperate. "Victoria, look at what they are doing to your father. Are you going to stand there and watch this? I am your blood. I am the reason you exist." Victoria stood in the center aisle. She was trembling, but her feet were planted firm. She looked at the man screaming her name. For years, that voice had controlled her. It had dictated what she wore, who she married, and how she lived. It had been the voice of God in her life. But tonight, looking at him thrashing in the grip of the police, she realized something profound. It was just the voice of a scared, small man. "Tell them to stop," Richard pleaded, his tone shifting from command to begging. "Tell them who I am. I gave you everything, Victoria. The cars, the clothes, the education. I made you who you are. You owe me. You cannot let them take me away." He was calling in the debt of her childhood. He was trying to guilt her into submission one last time. Victoria took a step forward. The crowd parted for her. She walked until she was standing at the foot of the stage. She looked up at her father. Her face was stained with tears, but her expression was stone. "You gave me things, Dad," Victoria said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every word. "You gave me objects. You gave me status. But you never gave me a father. You gave me a manager." Richard blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? I gave you a diamond necklace for your birthday last month. It is worth more than that mechanic makes in a decade." Victoria reached up to her neck. Her fingers found the clasp of the heavy diamond necklace that glittered under the stage lights. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was also a collar. It was the symbol of his ownership, a reminder that she was Sterling property. She undid the clasp. The diamonds felt heavy and cold in her hand. "You said that Kendrick and Leo were not worthy of your assets," Victoria said. "You said they were low-born. You said I had to choose between your money and my family." She held the necklace out. The diamonds caught the light, sparkling with a cold fire. "You were right, Dad," she said. "I am not worthy of your assets. Because your assets come with a price I am no longer willing to pay." She tossed the necklace onto the stage. It landed next to Richard's feet with a clatter. It looked like a pile of broken glass. "I choose my family," Victoria said, her voice ringing out clear and final. "I choose the mechanic. I choose the parking lot guard. I choose the people who love me for who I am, not for what I am worth on a balance sheet." Richard stared at the necklace. He looked back at his daughter. The rejection was absolute. She had not just returned a gift. She had returned his name. She had returned his legacy. "You are making a mistake," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. "You will be poor. You will be nothing. "I would rather be poor and loved than rich and lonely," Victoria replied. "Goodbye, Dad." She turned her back on him. She walked back to Kendrick. Kendrick opened his arms and she collapsed into them, sobbing. But they were tears of release. She was free. The police agents had seen enough. "Let it go," the lead agent barked. They began to drag Richard toward the exit. The crowd, which had once hung on his every word, now recoiled from him. People stepped back, pulling their expensive gowns and suits away to avoid touching him as he passed. He was toxic. He was radioactive. Richard twisted his head, scanning the faces of his friends, his business partners, his allies. He was looking for one person who was obligated to stand by him. "Patricia," he shouted. "Patricia, call the firm. Call the governor. Do something." Patricia Sterling, his wife of 35 years, stood near the exit doors. She was wearing a silver gown and holding a clutch purse that cost more than my house. She had watched the entire spectacle with a detached, cold expression. She saw the financial charts. She saw the arrest warrant. She saw the social suicide her husband had just committed. She was a Sterling by marriage, but she was a survivor by nature. She knew that the ship was sinking, and she had no intention of going down with the captain. When Richard called her name, she did not rush to him. She did not cry. She opened her clutch and pulled out her phone. She looked at Richard as he was dragged closer. "Do not call me Patricia," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a razor blade. Richard froze. "What?" "I just texted my lawyer," Patricia announced, loud enough for the press and the police to hear. "I am filing for divorce immediately. I am freezing my personal assets and separating them from the marital estate before you lose everything." Richard looked at her as if she had stabbed him. "Patricia, we have been married for 30 years. And for 30 years, I tolerated your arrogance because you were a winner," Patricia said, snapping her purse shut. "But I do not stay with losers, Richard, and I certainly do not stay with criminals. You are on your own." She turned to the police officer nearest to her. "Officer," she said coolly, "if you need a statement regarding his tax evasion, I have copies of his private ledgers in my safe. I will be happy to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for immunity." Richard let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a man realizing that his entire life had been a transaction. He had bought loyalty, he had bought love, and now that the money was gone, the receipt was void. He slumped in the arms of the agents. He stopped fighting. He looked at the floor. He was a man who had walked into the room as a king, surrounded by subjects. Now, he was walking out as a convict, betrayed by his wife, rejected by his daughter, and conquered by his enemy. I stood on the stage and watched him go. I saw the back of his head as they pushed him through the double doors. The doors swung shut, cutting off his final whimper. The room was silent again. The tension broke. The spell was lifted. I looked at Kendrick. He was holding Victoria, stroking her hair. They were safe. The monster was gone. The castle had fallen. I straightened my tie. I picked up the glass of water from the podium. I raised it to the empty space where Richard had stood. "To the victor," I whispered to myself. But the victory was not in the destruction of a man. It was in the salvation of a family. I walked down the stairs to join my children. The night was over, but the work was just beginning. We had a company to rebuild and a legacy to rewrite. And this time, we would write it in ink that would never fade. The morning sun hit the glass walls of the executive suite on the top floor of the Sterling building, but it did not feel like the same sun that had shone yesterday. Yesterday, the light had illuminated Richard Sterling's vanity. Today, it illuminated a battlefield that had been cleared of bodies. The office was empty. The cleaning crew had worked through the night to remove every trace of the former CEO. The pretentious oil paintings of Richard posing with polo horses were gone, leaving pale rectangles on the mahogany walls. The humidors full of Cuban cigars were gone. Even the smell of his lavender cologne had been scrubbed away with industrial cleaner. I stood by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. I was wearing my flannel shirt again. The tuxedo was back in the wardrobe. I did not need a costume to be powerful in this room. I owned the room. The door opened, and Kendrick walked in. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit. He looked different than he had 24 hours ago. The slump in his shoulders was gone. He walked with a new cadence, a rhythm of confidence. He looked at the empty office. He looked at the massive oak desk that sat in the center of the room like a throne. He walked over to it. He ran his hand along the smooth leather of the executive chair. It was the chair he had been fired from. It was the chair where Richard had sat when he told Kendrick that our blood was dirty. Kendrick took a deep breath. He turned the chair around. He prepared to sit down. "Do not sit there," I said. My voice was quiet, but it stopped him instantly. He froze, hovering inches above the leather seat. He looked at me, confused. "Dad, what do you mean? You bought the company. You fired Richard. This is my job now." I walked over to the desk. I picked up a heavy crystal paperweight. I looked at it, then put it down. "I bought the company, Kendrick," I said. "That means I own the assets. I own the machines. I own the debt. But I do not own your respect, and I certainly do not own your competence." Kendrick stood up straight. He looked hurt. "Dad, I ran the logistics for 5 years. I know this place better than anyone." "I know you do," I said. "But if you sit in that chair right now, just because your father conquered the enemy, then you are no better than Richard. Richard sat in that chair because his father gave it to him. He thought he deserved it by birthright. And look what happened. He rotted from the inside out." I pointed to the door. "Inheritance is a poison, son, unless you have the antidote of hard work. I cleared the path for you. I removed the obstacle. But I will not carry you across the finish line." Kendrick looked at the chair, then at me. "So what do you want me to do?" "I want you to earn it," I said. "The board of directors is meeting in the conference room in 20 minutes. They are terrified. They think I am going to install a puppet dictator. They think you are just a nepotism hire who is going to destroy what is left of the value." I adjusted my collar. "You are going to go in there, and you are going to interview for the job of CEO. You are not going to use my name. You are not going to mention the takeover. You are going to convince them that you are the only man on earth who can save this sinking ship. If they vote for you, the chair is yours. If they do not, we look for another candidate." Kendrick stared at me for a long moment. He searched my face for a sign that I was joking. He found none. He saw the same man who had made him struggle through job interviews in the snow. He smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. "Okay," Kendrick said. "Let us go to work." 20 minutes later, the conference room was thick with tension. 12 men and women sat around the long oval table. These were the survivors, the board members who had enabled Richard for years, who had looked the other way while he cooked the books because the stock price remained stable. Now, they looked like frightened children. They knew I held 80% of the equity. They knew I could fire them all with a snap of my fingers. I sat in the corner of the room, in a simple chair against the wall. I did not sit at the head of the table. I folded my arms and waited. The door opened. Kendrick walked in. He did not walk in like a conqueror. He walked in like an engineer. He carried a stack of files under his arm. He did not look at me. He walked straight to the head of the table. He did not sit down. He remained standing. "Good morning," Kendrick said. His voice was steady. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man named Henderson, who had personally signed the letter blacklisting Kendrick, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes," Henderson said nervously, "we understand that your father is the new majority owner. We assume this is just a formality to announce your appointment." Kendrick dropped the files onto the table. "This is not a formality," Kendrick said, "and my father has nothing to do with this presentation." He opened the first file. He pulled out a schematic. It was a blueprint of the factory floor, covered in red ink. "For the last 3 years, under the previous administration, our efficiency rating dropped by 14%, Kendrick began. He did not use flowery language. He used data. He spoke the language of profit and loss. He moved around the table, handing out reports. "You were told that the supply chain issues were due to market volatility," Kendrick continued. "That was a lie. The issues were internal. We were paying 40% above market rate for raw materials because the CEO insisted on using vendors who gave him kickbacks." The board members picked up the papers. They began to read. Their eyes widened. Kendrick was showing them the autopsy of the company. He was showing them exactly where the money had been bleeding out. I watched him from the corner. I saw the passion in his eyes. He was not talking about revenge. He was talking about optimization. He was talking about fixing the broken systems he had agonized over for years. "I have a plan to restructure our debt, renegotiate our vendor contracts, and bring the efficiency rating back up to 90% within 6 months, Kendrick said. "But it will require sacrifice. No more executive bonuses for 2 years. No more private jets. We are going back to basics. We are going to build things that work." Henderson looked up from the report. He looked at Kendrick with a newfound respect. He realized that the man standing before him was not a boy riding his father's coattails. He was a savant who had been silenced for too long. Kendrick finished his presentation. He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. "I am not asking for this job because my name is on the building," Kendrick said. "I am asking for this job because I am the only one who knows how to keep the lights on." The room was silent. Henderson looked at me in the corner. I did not nod. I did not signal. I just stared back. Henderson turned to the rest of the board. "All in favor of appointing Kendrick Hayes as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately?" Every hand in the room went up. It was unanimous. Kendrick let out a breath he had been holding for 5 years. He looked at me. I gave him a single, slow nod. "Congratulations, Mr. Hayes," Henderson said. "The chair is yours." Kendrick walked out of the conference room as the CEO of Sterling Manufacturing. But his first act was not to order new furniture. It was not to call the press. He walked straight to the Human Resources Department. The HR director, a woman who had been forced to process Kendrick's firing papers just days ago, looked up in terror as he approached her desk. "Mr. Hayes," she stammered, "I am so sorry. I was just following orders." "Relax," Kendrick said. "I am not here to fire you. I need you to draft a document." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a handwritten note he had made on the back of a napkin during our breakfast that morning. "I want to establish a new scholarship fund," Kendrick said. The HR director blinked. "A scholarship fund?" "Yes," Kendrick said. "The Hayes Initiative. It will be funded by the CEO's salary. I am taking a $1 salary for the first year. The rest of the money goes into this fund." He tapped the paper. "The fund is specifically for the children of our factory floor workers. It covers full tuition for trade schools, engineering programs, and university degrees. And I want a special clause included." "What clause?" the director asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Priority is given to applicants from the South Side," Kendrick said. "And priority is given to those who have been told that they do not fit the mold." I stood in the doorway, listening. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was the Reconstruction. Richard Sterling had spent his life trying to build walls to keep people out. He believed that bloodlines were about exclusion. Kendrick was using the same bricks to build bridges. He was turning the company into a ladder for people like us. Kendrick signed the authorization form. He used a cheap ballpoint pen he had taken from my truck. The scratch of the ink on the paper sounded better than any symphony I had ever heard. He handed the paper back to the director. "Make it happen," Kendrick said. "Today." He turned and saw me standing there. He walked over to me. "Did I pass the interview?" he asked. "You did okay," I said, keeping my face stern but failing to hide the pride in my eyes. "But do not get comfortable. If the efficiency rating drops, I will be the first one to call you out." Kendrick laughed. He hugged me. It was a strong hug, the embrace of two men who had fought a war back to back and survived. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "For the suit, for the money, for everything." I patted his back. "I did not give you anything," I said. "I just reminded you of what you already had." We walked out of the HR office together. The factory floor below was starting to hum again. The steel shipments had arrived. The workers were back at their stations, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear was gone. The machines were running, not for a tyrant, but for a leader who knew their names. I looked at the factory. I looked at my son. The order had been restored, but it was not the old order. It was something new, something stronger. It was a legacy built not on the color of our skin or the zeros in our bank account, but on the content of our character. And that was a foundation that no earthquake could ever shake. The headset dug into Richard Sterling's temple, a constant, pinching reminder of his new reality. He sat in a gray cubicle that smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. It was his 30th day at the call center, the only place in Chicago that would hire a man with a pending felony trial for tax evasion. The office was a windowless room in a basement, a far cry from the glass penthouse where he used to survey his empire. Around him, dozens of other operators droned on in a hive of misery, reading from scripts that stripped away their individuality. Richard adjusted his microphone. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now dry and shaking. A light blinked on his screen. Another call. Another complaint. Another person treating him like he was nothing. He clicked the button. "Thank you for calling Speedy Internet Solutions," Richard recited, his voice cracking with the effort of feigning politeness. "My name is Richard. How can I help you today?" The voice on the other end was shrill and angry. It was a woman complaining about her bill. She screamed at him. She called him incompetent. She called him stupid. Richard closed his eyes. He remembered the way he used to speak to waiters. He remembered the way he had spoken to Solomon. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. It was forcing him to listen to the echo of his own arrogance 8 hours a day. "Sterling!" a voice barked from the end of the aisle. Richard jumped. He looked up to see his shift supervisor, a 25-year-old man named Kyle, who wore a polyester tie and wielded his tiny amount of power like a club. "You are under quota, Sterling," Kyle shouted, tapping his clipboard. "Your call time is too high. Stop chatting and start solving tickets. If you do not pick up the pace, I am docking your pay." "I am trying," Richard whispered. "The system is slow today." "Do not blame the system," Kyle sneered. "Blame the operator. You think because you used to be somebody that you get special treatment? You are nobody here. Now get back to work before I write you up." Richard slumped in his chair. He was 60 years old. He was tired. He was broken. The lunch bell rang. It was the only mercy of the day. Richard stood up and walked to the break room. It was a cramped space with a vending machine that hummed too loudly. He sat at a sticky table. He opened a brown paper bag. Inside was a sandwich made of white bread and cheap bologna. He looked at it. He remembered the lobster bisque at the country club. He remembered the Wagyu beef at the gala. He took a bite. The bread was dry. It stuck to the roof of his mouth. He chewed slowly, tasting the bitterness of his fall. He looked at his reflection in the dark window of the vending machine. The man staring back was unrecognizable. The silver hair was unkempt. The eyes were hollow. He was the parasite now. He was the one living on the margins, hoping for a scrap of kindness that never came. He finished the sandwich in silence, terrified of the moment the bell would ring again. Miles away from the suffocating gray walls of the call center, the world was painted in shades of blue and gold. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. We were at the lake, a private spot I had bought years ago and kept secret, just like everything else. There were no tuxedos here. There were no boardrooms. There were no financial charts. There was just the gentle lapping of water against the hull of a small aluminum boat. I sat in the stern, holding a fishing rod, watching the line disappear into the deep water. In the bow, Kendrick was teaching Leo how to cast. My son was wearing a thick wool sweater and jeans. The stress lines that had etched themselves into his face over the last 5 years were gone, smoothed away by the simple rhythm of nature. He looked younger. He looked free. "Watch your thumb, Leo," Kendrick said softly, his voice full of patience. "You have to release the button right as you swing, like this." Leo swung the rod. The line flew out, landing with a quiet splash near the reeds. "I did it!" Leo cheered, his laughter ringing out across the water. "I did it, Grandpa!" "Did you see?" "I saw it," I called back, smiling until my cheeks hurt. "That was a perfect cast. You are a natural." Kendrick looked back at me. He smiled. It was not the guarded smile of a man protecting his family from a threat. It was the open, easy smile of a son sharing a moment with his father. "Thank you for bringing us here, Dad," Kendrick said. I forgot what quiet sounded like. "You needed it," I said. "The company will be there on Monday. The emails can wait. This cannot." Kendrick nodded. He looked at Leo, who was staring intently at the bobber, waiting for a bite. "He asked about Richard yesterday," Kendrick said quietly. "He asked why Grandpa Richard doesn't visit anymore." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that Richard went away to learn how to be nice," Kendrick said, "and that until he learns, he has to stay in time out." I chuckled. That is a kind way to put it. Leo's rod jerked suddenly. The bobber vanished. "I got one!" Leo screamed. "I got one! Reel it in!" Kendrick shouted, jumping up to help him. "Keep the tip up!" I watched them struggle with the fish. I saw Kendrick's hands over Leo's hands, guiding him, supporting him, but letting him do the work. It was the same way I had taught Kendrick. It was the circle closing. The fish broke the surface, a flash of silver in the sunlight. It was a small bass, but to Leo, it was a monster. They pulled it into the boat, cheering and high-fiving. I sat back and took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs. This was wealth. This was the only asset that truly mattered. The sound of my grandson's joy and the sight of my son at peace were worth more than every factory in the world. As I watched the sun begin to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in strokes of purple and orange, I thought about the word that had started this entire war: bloodline. Richard Sterling had used it as a weapon. He had used it to measure worth, to separate the gold from the dirt. He thought bloodline was about pedigree. He thought it was about who your ancestors were and how much land they owned. He thought it was a fortress you built to keep others out. He was wrong. I looked at the water, reflecting the sky. A bloodline is not a wall. It is a river. It flows from the past, carrying the strength and the struggle of those who came before us. My bloodline does not come from kings or dukes. It comes from men who bent steel with their hands. It comes from women who walked miles to clean houses so their children could read. It comes from survivors who knew that dignity is not something you buy, but something you build. I looked at Kendrick, unhooking the fish and gently releasing it back into the water. Legacy is not the number in your bank account. That number can vanish in a heartbeat, as Richard learned. Legacy is not the name on a building. Buildings crumble, signs fade. Legacy is character. Legacy is the moment your son stands up to a tyrant, not with violence, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his own value. Legacy is when he refuses to let the world turn him bitter. Legacy is when he takes the stones thrown at him and uses them to build a scholarship fund for children he will never meet. And most of all, legacy is seeing your grandson look in the mirror and like what he sees. It is knowing that Leo will never feel inferior because of the color of his skin or the texture of his hair. He will know that he comes from iron. He will know that he comes from love. The wind picked up, rippling the water. I reeled in my line. The war was over. The reconstruction was well underway. Kendrick looked back at me. "You ready to head in, Dad?" I smiled at him. "I am ready," I said. We started the motor and headed toward the shore. The engine hummed a steady, reliable tune. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my family moving forward, leaving the ghosts of the past behind in the wake. Thank you for listening to my story. It was a long journey, but we made it to the other side. I hope it reminded you that no matter how dark the winter gets, spring always comes for those who plant the seeds of truth. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to fight for your family's dignity. And tell me, what does legacy mean to you? Is it what you leave in your will, or is it who you raise? Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. Until next time, remember to stand tall. You are the author of your own story. Make it a good one. This journey taught me that true power is not found in the loudness of your title, but in the quiet strength of your character. Richard Sterling believed that wealth made him superior, but he forgot that a castle built on arrogance will always crumble against the storms of truth. I learned that a father's job is not just to protect his children from the cold, but to empower them to build their own fire. The greatest legacy we leave behind is not the money in our wills, but the resilience we plant in the hearts of those we raise. Dignity is the only currency that never devalues, and family is defined not by blood, but by loyalty. If this story ignited a fire in you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales of justice and redemption. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were better than you? And how did you prove them wrong? I read every single story. Until next time, stay strong.